So as I said, we're moving into the second half of the day, and we will begin our program with the chair of Northeastern's Art and Design Department, Nathan Feldy, who has been very supportive of this entire initiative, collaboration, symposium from day one, and really would not have been possible without his support. So without further ado, let me welcome Nathan Feldy to the stage.
Thank you, Bree, and welcome again. You've been welcomed. I guess my job is to make sure that you're still comfortable here in the hospitality of Northeastern University, but also comfortable in each other's company. I thought it was brilliant to set this up with these tables, because the point that was made about that the most valuable information, conversations were happening at Black Mountain College at those long dinner tables reminded me a little bit of Marlboro Music Festival, where the same thing happens amongst musicians. But I brought with me a map, because when Gloria asked me to speak briefly about this, I said, well, okay, what could I possibly say? I'm kind of notorious for these maps with my faculty, but I made a map of my connections to Black Mountain College. I was kind of surprised as I developed this map, but it begins with the fact that I grew up in Appalachia. So I had a different kind of connection. I grew up in the context, and I'm really what in that period of time would be called a displaced person back during those days. A person who should be living somewhere else, but was living in the wrong place. So they're refugee, immigrant of various sorts, and waves of immigration that have come here. And that's a factor in who happened to be at Black Mountain College and why they happened to be in such a place. I grew up on the other side of the mountain in Harlan County, in coal country, and so we always thought of North Carolina as those kind of fancy people over there. It was much more primitive where we lived. But nevertheless, there was a still kind of a palpable Elysium, was the way Jonathan Williams would refer to the people who were related to or connected to similar kinds of endeavors, similar kinds of places. Such as Berea College, which is still to this day a college like Black Mountain College where students work for their tuition, maybe one of the only two left in this country, which do so for the various reasons that Black Mountain College also did that. So these maps, this map is really reference another connection through Guy Davenport, who wrote Geography of the Imagination. These are kind of a geography for me, and I looked at my own life as I looked across and looked into Black Mountain College again as a life living in the after effects or aftershocks of Black Mountain College. As a young college student, for the college students here, I actually spent a full day with our Buckminster Fuller, and I don't think I ever recovered. I'm still in recovery. He was, as the legend goes, he was extremely dynamic and spoke almost the way he wrote, for those of you who have tried to read his writings. I also got to know Aaron Siskind, and through various other connections on our side of the mountain, Richard Chase, who was from North Carolina and collected folktales, was able to get much better sense of the connections between people who were in the generations following Black Mountain College and how they affected lives of people like myself. So it also resonates with that part of the world where Shaker communities, Amish communities, Mennonite communities, communities connected to the earth, connected to the ground. The fact that Black Mountain College produced its own food was not insignificant, and those communities were well known in that part of the world. But I also have another personal connection to our Buckminster Fuller, or Bucky, I guess as they say, he was preferred. We didn't call him that. That my niece is the caretaker of the family island, Bear Island. So my children grew up around in the Penobscot area. And Bear Island was an island you could see from Eagle Island. And Macy, who is a young artist, is now the caretaker of that island. So if you want to go live where Buckminster Fuller lived for a while in the summer, you can come and see me. I'll see what I can do for you to breathe those vapors. So I mention that because it struck me that, in some sense, what people had created at Black Mountain College and in other places were very island-like, that they were either an island or an oasis, and it struck me as similar to what happens in a vessel, a crew in a boat or a vessel. The people put themselves together in a situation where they become interdependent in ways they wouldn't otherwise. And it may be, that may be a factor in why certain things happen in that context. It also struck me that here at Northeastern, in our department, that not by any plan, but it appears that the immersive studios that we offer our students in the summertime are actually on islands too. Iceland, Cuba, Ireland, the Galapagos, Venice is still an island, right? And Berlin, which was an island for a long time culturally. But I think what characterized the communities I've lived within, which include music communities, Interlochen Arts Academy, Pine Mountain Settlement School, and places like that, the thing that strikes me about a comparison with these people and their more famous biographies is that they were all very curious. And curiosity was sort of the heart of their affect. I think the curiosity had something to do with dislocation. If you're dislocated a lot, if you're very familiar with where you are, you can kind of lose your curiosity about it. The other thing is, I think conversation was a huge part of that, and that's why the dinner meetings and being together for food or for music, but certainly for food supported that kind of conversation. The conversation is very different from communication, as Jean Youngblood would point out. It's the converse is to turn together, so that suggests that subtle but significant difference. And then the whole idea of community and then forming culture out of community, or a kind of cultural grenades that went off as people moved out of that space and that place. And the other thing I think is, it seems to me that Black Mountain College wasn't about a movement or trying to start a movement, but it was more about a moment and moments and reestablishing those kinds of moments amongst people. So there's a connection with Black Mountain College to an area that I'm quite interested in, which is a connection to Gregory Bateson and Margaret Mead, and a little tangle that's going on in the domain of technology. But in 1948, Norbert Wiener published and coined the word cybernetics to describe the area in which he was working. And this set up a little bit of contention, I would say, between him and Claude Shannon. And you might describe that as analog versus digital. Digital kind of won the day, but it's time for the analog to come back. And I think Norbert Wiener's work in cybernetics is actually going to establish a new basis for understanding how conversation actually works. So I look forward to that development, and I think we're positioned quite well to carry that forward here at Northeastern in particular. And we support it practically and palpably in the kinds of tables we put out for you. So that's something to keep track of, but I think in this world where, neuro and nano and anticipatory and cybernetic are filling the airwaves, so to speak, I think it's good to think in terms of what other questions might be asked that are aesthetic in a more profound sense, or about etiquette or protocol or how we treat each other. And I think that will come to define more than anything what advances can occur in the connection back to the sciences, back to the bringing humanities back together, that and the liberal arts back, and thinking perhaps of an artistic practice which comes closer to, but may not be entirely, what Buckminster Fuller referred to as comprehensive, anticipatory design science. But thinking of that as an artistic practice and how it engages with the world, I think is very important. So as a As a person who understands that now everyone is everywhere, and this idea of being in a place seems a little archaic, I think one of the questions that faces us is, what does it mean for each of us to be indigenous? And there was some discussion a little bit earlier about the context in Appalachia and the community in Appalachia and integration and segregation. I not only at one time attended a one-room school, but also a segregated school for which down the road was a less better constructed, let me call it, school for the other. So with this map that I've been working from in my comments, I wanted to also leave this other map with you as kind of the image I want to have in your mind of this background of immigration in a context of war that created a place where necessity and not having made it possible for people to innovate and improvise in ways they might not have otherwise. So thank you again for coming. I really appreciate it, and we hope we can continue to build this community. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Jenni Sorkin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again to Nathan and Feldy and Northeastern for hosting this symposium today, and to all of you once again for coming. I'm up here, I'm Jenni Sorkin. I teach at UC Santa Barbara. Gloria and I have been planning and in dialogue for a very long time over many of these sort of issues around Black Mountain, and so part of our interest in creating a gathering like this was really to have a space to try to hash out what happens after Black Mountain, and how some of these ethoses, the ethos of experimentation, the legacy of the avant-garde, how art making comes to bear onto practices today. So I'm going to give you my very quick overview of what we're talking about this afternoon, which is markers of influence and comparative pedagogies and utopia. There's a description in the back of your symposium brochure. But part of this has also been, and I'm going to make Cage the straw man again here, but really this starting point of some of the most famous canonical people who we hear associated with Black Mountain again and again, like David Tudor and John Cage, who you see here, were really only there for incredibly brief spans of time. Cage came for 2 different summers, summer of 48 and summer of 52, when he made theater piece number 1. But also, it's lesser known that he didn't actually have any students. Nobody signed up for his class, and he didn't actually like teaching, and he couldn't get anybody to sign up for his class because part of it was engaging in a kind of awful cutting of his sort of piecing together his early electronica sound work, and nobody wanted to cut and tape and paste electronic tape together all summer, so they didn't take his class. But what Black Mountain does is create these situations for people to find each other and later go on to collaborate. And this is an image we saw last night that I actually didn't even know involved Stan Vanderbeek, so I wasn't able to change the slide to include him in this, but this is the kind of Black Mountain reassembles itself in many, many ways, and while there's been a lot that's been written about the demise and failure of the college to sustain itself, I think one of the other models for thinking about it is an alternative space. There is an alternative space model that's here, where you have this real intensity of production and collaboration over a very short span of time, and what that allows for is people to take those ideas and spread them outward to other parts of the country. So there was a reassembly in San Francisco, and in particular in New York, in communities like this one that you see here, where people start to collaborate at places like Pocket Theater or the Living Theater, also experimental venues in Lower Manhattan. What I'm also interested in, particularly in my own work, and a large chunk of my own book project, my book comes out this spring. It's called Live Form Women, Ceramics, and Community. So it takes the post-war history of ceramics and traces it partially through Black Mountain, and M.C. Richards has been one of the key figures for me in this book project. But also thinking about the anonymity of the art student and how, while we praise the idea of art education, the reality of art education is, in this country, both then and now, is that most people who go to some sort of art program don't go on to make work. They don't become professional artists. And, you know, there's a statistic in MFA programs today that 50% of everybody, you know, within 2 years stops making artwork. But if we think of the arts at the center of a curriculum for thinking about creating what M.C. Richards called a whole person, this larger humanistic discourse around really having a good citizen out in the world, somebody with a well-rounded education who was in touch with their own humanity, and she believed you could only have that humanity through coming to it through a kind of arts discourse, through making. And that making took many forms. So she was somebody who not only did the translation and taught English at Black Mountain, but also was the progenitor of many of the avant-garde theatrical pieces as a director of events like the Ruse of the Medusa in '48. And so I'm struck by this image of her surrounded by these anonymous students. And that's what we often get in the archive of many, many arts programs, is anonymous students. And so we're really interested in this conference in trying to come to issues of influence. And what does it mean to be influenced by a particular set of ideas through an arts education or a discourse that you're immersed in? Along this line of thought, one of the least known people who actually was a student of M.C. Richards, who came out of Black Mountain as a student, was John Leo Herlihy, who actually wrote the Midnight Cowboy novel that became this very famous early, what's considered to be one of the earliest queer movies, in the sense that there's two male protagonists in it. There's a kind of complexity of love and emotion and sexual identity between them. It wins the Academy Award. But he was a writer who, James Leo Herlihy was a writer who did not follow the Charles Olson line of thinking or poetics, and he leaves quite early disgusted with that train of thought, but he stays in touch with MC his entire life, and there's a huge body of notating of their manuscripts back and forth that I found in the archives. So that's been really interesting, and is, you know, like one of the beginnings for, you know, somebody else to come along and do this work. And also that's the idea of the incompleteness of this archival project, is that an exhibition is really only a beginning and sort of an opening space for people to come and take on other pieces of it and continue to work on these thoughts going forward, particularly regarding the idea of pedagogy and teaching. And so I think I will end there and turn this over to Michael LaBelle, who is our first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Okay. You know, I'm going to hold this. Okay. Well, I want to really thank Jenni and Gloria and Bree and the staff here for all of the work they've done at putting together this really remarkable event, and thanks to all of you for inviting me. What I really want to do, and I will trust that Jenni and Gloria will be absolutely precise with my timing. So I have all this pressure right now. I have to try to present some interesting material and then keep it within a very short time window. But I just really today want to tell you a very simple story about two young artists both of who were connected to Black Mountain, who spent time at Black Mountain. And I want to tell you a story about their collaboration and build on some things that have been discussed today already, particularly by Jenni and Gloria, about not only historical recuperation and documentation. Ruth also discussed some of these issues in her talk, but also those who get more attention and are more high profile, and those who perhaps don't get quite as much attention in their careers. And this comes up in this collaboration. So I want to talk about collaboration and then finally look at some of the historical record and see if there are ways that we might be able to look at things a little differently so that we can reconsider the historical record. And I'm talking, of course, about two artists, Susan Weil and Robert Rauschenberg, who from about 1949 to 1951 collaboratively produced a series of works, blueprint works. They're very simple works. They use a very simple process using blueprint paper, which most of us know for the production of architectural blueprints, and are really just a version of very, very long-standing simple photographic process. They're basically cyanotypes. And Susan Weil and Robert Rauschenberg together produced a series of works, primarily figurative works, although not exclusively, over this course of about a year and a half, 2 years, in which they laid figures, models, sometimes other materials, onto blueprints, blueprint paper, rolls of blueprint paper, exposed them, and then you're seeing the resulting works here and here. I think they're a remarkable series of works. They're somewhat under-investigated and under-known, so I was very happy to see that Helen and Ruth included one of these works in the ICA exhibition. And because I didn't know exactly what was going to be in the exhibition, I don't have it in my PowerPoint, but that will just give you even more of a reason to go to the ICA to see that exhibition. And in fact, the blueprint process itself came out of Susan Weil's family history. I'm showing you an image right now of the marriage of these two people. It was actually a very short-term marriage. It produced not only the blueprint works, but a son, Christopher. And for those of you who are interested, the kind of story of the dissolution of that marriage and then Rauschenberg moving on to other relationships is a very interesting one, and it's one that's been chronicled by art historians, including Jonathan Katz. But I'm showing you Rauschenberg and Weil's wedding day on Outer Island off the coast of Connecticut, and it was there, we think around 1949. A number of people today have also talked about the difficulty of documenting the past, and we see this again and again. We don't know exactly when, but we think it was the summer of 1949. And the production of the blueprints overlaps but doesn't perfectly coincide with Weil and Rauschenberg's time at Black Mountain. It was on Outer Island that Sue Weil introduced Rauschenberg to this process that her family had used mostly as a kind of arts and crafts technique. And then they began to produce these works together. But as I noted, Weil and Rauschenberg both spent a good deal of time at Black Mountain. And I think one of the questions we could begin by asking is, how perhaps did the time at Black Mountain impact the blueprint works and the production of the blueprint works? And I'm sure Ruth has her own answer to that question, which we might want to find out. I think one possible answer, one that again sort of raises an issue that's been brought up by Gloria and Jenni and others, is our understanding of maybe even today as the opportunity to sort of shift gears, move, for instance, not to put too fine fine a point on it, from John Cage to M.C. Richards, move from better-known figures to, for instance, a figure like Hazel Larson Archer, who it sounds like, if I understood what Sarah was talking about last night, was influential on Stan Vanderbeek, and who is clearly a significant influence on Rauschenberg. We actually see Rauschenberg dancing in the photograph below, but the two photographs above of Merce Cunningham and this approach to the figure, the kind of capturing of a figure in a particular moment in time, and this kind of very close cropping seems very closely related and perhaps a strong kind of impact on the production of these blueprint works. Another thing I want to say, two other things I want to say just very quickly about these works. One, another kind of impact that the spirit of Black Mountain College may have had on these works is that they're fundamentally collaborative. Some of these works, these are both, I don't know exactly what to call them ever. The piece on the left has sometimes been referred to as a Rauschenberg self-portrait, but of course it can't be, because if Rauschenberg had to lay down on the blueprint paper, it was laid down on the ground and then exposed using a special light bulb, if he had to lay down on the paper to have his image left on it, then he couldn't have been using the light bulb to actually expose the paper. So these are fundamentally collaborative works. And that's one of the things I've been interested in looking at them and then thinking about this theme that's come up again and again, yesterday evening, all day today, this issue of collaboration. Many of us practicing art historians, I would count myself in this, mea culpa, can find ourselves focusing on one single figure and looking at a work. A body of one single figure's work provides a kind of easy, simple frame for understanding that work, but we have to understand these works as collaborative. And Black Mountain gives a kind of framework, I think, for us today and moving forward to think about the issue of collaboration. I also want to finally say, and I would encourage all of you to go to the ICA and look at the work in the ICA, because I was standing in front of it for a long time yesterday evening, and one of the problems with these blueprints is that we think they were very simply produced, which is someone laid down on the blueprint paper and then the image was exposed. Art historians today love the term indexical because it makes us sound very smart and theoretical, but usually suggests a kind of instantaneous and simple imprint of an image on a receptor surface. And in fact, the work at the ICA is not that at all. And I would sort of suggest or dare or recommend that some of you go and look at the work in the ICA and think about how it was produced, because it's actually a very complicated image that must have been produced through at least 2 or 3 different goes with the bulb. Finally, these blueprint works were very, very significant to these younger artists. We see the impact of these works throughout their careers. But why, I've been wondering, have they been kind of underknown and underinvestigated? And I just want to comment on that finally in my final comments. How much time do I have? I have 6 minutes. Oh my God, I could talk about a whole other topic in that. Generally, these works are not that well known. I think that's partly because they were collaborative, but a few other reasons. One, they were produced commercially. Weil and Rauschenberg produced many of them for commercial purposes for Jean Moore at Bonwit Teller, who employed a whole generation of artists to produce window displays for Bonwit Teller, including Andy Warhol and James Rosenquist. So their commercial origins have been difficult to get past. Art historians still, I think, prefer luxe objects, museums do, although the current show at the ICA suggests in part otherwise. So their commercial origins have been hard, I think, to get around. We don't know how many there were originally. And in fact, I'm not actually supposed to be showing you this image. It's from the Archives of American Art. I'm sure I'm going to get a legal letter in a few weeks about this, but it's such a great letter. It's from the filmmaker Emile D'Antonio writing to Leo Castelli in the early 1970s, and he says, I have the Rauschenberg drafting paper works. He's referring to the blueprints. There are 40 of them in good condition. We don't know where those went. They may no longer be in existence. They may have been destroyed. So we can't even, this gets back to some of the issues around historical research and the ICA show on Black Mountain. We still have, and this is for the students in the room, since there's so many of you, there's still so much work to be done on these topics. I keep emphasizing to my students, history is not finished, it's in flux and in process. We're continuing to write it. And finally, many of the works that we do have documentation for no longer exist and only exist as photographs that were reproduced in an article in Life magazine in April 1951. And I just want to conclude by reviewing that article for you and showing you what we can maybe learn from it. The article showed Robert Rauschenberg and Susan Weil producing the blueprints. It has most often been compared to an article from Life from just a few years prior, which is famous for kind of profiling Jackson Pollock, one of the leading figures of abstract expressionism. And in fact, the photographs that ran in the Life magazine article that I'm showing you, the two ones on the left, of blueprint works being made are very similar and almost imitate very closely these images of Pollock dripping paint, these legendary ones. However, there's a crucial distinction, and I've been thinking a lot about this Life magazine article and the distinctions, and we probably want to draw a distinction between the generation of abstract expressionism and the kind of neo-Dada approach that Rauschenberg and Weil and Jasper Johns represented. And the fact of the matter is that even though this is the comparison that tends to get made, these two articles, the article on the blueprints in Life magazine was not about art. It was not in the art section of Life. It was actually in a section called Speaking of Pictures, and it was a section or a part of Life magazine that had run since the second issue of Life, that was about the importance of pictures, particularly photography. So it was the magazine's attempt to emphasize its editorial mission of a kind of engagement with a world of pictures. And Susan Weil, who I interviewed last year, in fact said that Rauschenberg went to the Life magazine editorial offices, and this we can know sort of about the ambition of this young artist to sell them on this profile. And I just want to clarify something, and this gets to the final point I want to make, which is about recuperating and about figures, and we've talked about race and gender. I found this online. All apologies to the blogger on greg.org. But online, this picture is captioned Rauschenberg and Weil making a blueprint photogram, which suggests that that's Susan Weil on the paper. It's not, in fact. A model was hired by Life to participate in this photo shoot. And the unfortunate aspect of the Life magazine article in its replication of the earlier Pollock model is that just as Lee Krasner was shown sitting in the background watching her husband, her better known and more well-received husband making a painting, so too in the Life article, and I'm still working through this because Weil and Rauschenberg were always absolutely adamant that these were collaborative works. And yet the Life article and the photographs in the Life article always show Rauschenberg making the works, and Susan Weil in a secondary position, really passive, doing nothing. Now, I think that this was probably a product of the photographer's direction, but it's a problem, and we've been talking a lot, and the ICA show raises this kind of problem. What do we do with a historical record that's sexist, that overlooks or obscures the contributions of women? And I just want to suggest we don't need to necessarily leave things there. We can, and Gloria and I talked about what is it that art historians do. We can talk about this in this symposium, and what can we do? We can do things. So I don't want to leave it here with Susan Weil set in a kind of secondary passive role, because if we look closely at these photographs, they suggest that Weil and Rauschenberg were very savvy about staging the space that they were taken in. They were living in the West 90s in New York City in a one-room apartment. In fact, the photographs in the bathroom, that was a shared bathroom. So I asked her, you mean people had to wait to use the bathroom while you were developing the blueprints? She said yes. So if we look closely at one of these life photographs, this one, now Rauschenberg is, again, actively making a blueprint. If we look in back, we recognize two paintings in back there, or I'll tell you what they are. There's one above and one below, and they're both paintings by Susan Weil. And in fact, the one above is no longer extant, we think, but the one below is. It's the work I'm showing you now, this piece called Eden. And I actually asked Weil last year, did you guys stage the room? And she said, no, that's how it was. I wonder about that, because these pictures are so carefully placed. And I know some of you may be thinking, well, you're sort of overinterpreting. It's not only the way they're placed, which is central, but that this is one of the blueprint works that were made in those sessions. And if you look closely, you'll see that its subject, a figure in a kind of verdant field of greenery, reiterates the subject of Susan Weil's painting. And I think that there was these were two young, we've been talking a lot about ambition and collaboration. These were two young, very ambitious artists working collaboratively, and there's room in here to see that they were shaping the historical record. And I want to leave you there because it's sort of an interesting thing that we often don't discuss or talk about or even consider when we're doing the kind of historical work that the exhibition does. And we also have artists speaking today, which is a very good thing. But artists, the things that we often look at as documentation, artists often, in very savvy and canny ways, shape that record of historical documentation to tell particular stories. And I think, at best, it can be the work of art historians and curators and those of us who are in the position to interpret the historical record to recognize and resonate with those kind of possibilities. Thank you.
Thank you. It's terrific to be here. I want to echo all of the gratitude to Gloria and Jenni, and also to Dean Elizabeth Hudson. Do I do anything? And also Art and Design Chair Nathan Feldy for inviting me to be a part of this incredible day. These are not my slides, unfortunately. Should I just... Is it the next one? Okay. And perfect. All right. And I want to also particularly thank Gloria, a terrific colleague, for dragging me out of my disciplinary comfort zone and enforcing a notion of interdisciplinarity that I think surely the members of Black Mountain College would have approved of, for I am neither an artist, nor an art historian, nor a curator, nor a scholar of Black Mountain College. What I am is an architectural historian and theorist here at the School of Architecture at Northeastern, And my work actually focuses largely on post-war American and European architecture, as well as contemporary American architectural theory and practice. So what the heck am I doing in this symposium? My research, and in conversation with Gloria, my recent research has really focused around the question of influence. And I want to bring up some questions today around that topic. This spring I'll be teaching a course at Northeastern, an interdisciplinary honors course, for those of you students out there, funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, in which I'm looking at this question of influence broadly across arts and architecture. And I was really struck, in particular, as many people have mentioned today, by Gloria's really precise framing of this and the provocation that she made in the thematic for my panel, which is about, how do we conceive of influence? And that really resonates with me and the work that I am doing. So to speak of influence is really to allude to something, I would say, sort of intriguing but imprecise, if not slightly anachronistic, maybe even taboo, right? It's less precise and less purposeful than a term like appropriation. I think in particular with respect to modern and contemporary work, influence is problematic. Architectural historian James Ackerman writes that the concept of influence has, quote, oppressed the modern maker, end quote. I'm not sure I would go that far, but I think there is a sense, and particularly among theorists and historians, that have marginalized or even rejected that concept as antithetical to a focus on originality and novelty. So how do we talk about influence in relation to architecture or to the arts and humanities more broadly? I begin with an image taken from a book titled The Frozen Fountain, which was written in 1924 by American architect Claude Bragdon. And in the image we see Sinbad, an artist and the story's protagonist, who walks hunched over with the weight of the old man on the sea on his shoulders. And if we see that old man is holding a series of classical columns and dragging behind him all this ornamental fragments, more ruins of classical architecture litter the margin of the image with this Acropolis-like ruined figure in the background. Bragdon's image was a polemic against an ornamental system based on the forms of classicism, and he championed instead an ornamental system based on natural forms and patterns, and interestingly was actually quite influential on the work of Bucky Fuller. But for Bragdon, the artist is literally under the weight of precedent, as he shows us here. The past is a burden. And I want to point out also, I hadn't thought of this until I was just listening to some of the talks, that not only the artifacts of classical architecture, but the figure also, and this is something maybe we can talk about, the notion of influence is emerging from a series of works or from emerging from particular figures. And I begin with this image because I think to some degree this attitude still prevails. I know within the field of architecture, certainly, and perhaps the arts and humanities more broadly, I think there's this sense that we have to free ourselves from the past in order to create a relentless contemporary focus on innovation, a word we use a lot here at Northeastern, reinforces, I think, to some degree this rejection or at least a diminution of the role of the past. In architecture, I can speak of more confidently, this is in large part due to a kind of hangover from postmodernism that we're still taking Advil for, a movement from the 70s and 80s that was steeped in a kind of seemingly superficial historicist pastiche. But with the subsequent fall of postmodernism, although I should say there's a neo-postmodernism emerging in architecture, but with the fall of postmodernism, it's seemingly taken with it all possibility for historical reference. Or at least I would say because of that, we've lost our ability to carefully consider the role that the past plays in the creative act. We've lost our ability to measure influence. So I just want to take you through a few examples of my own work where I'm trying to relearn, to teach myself how to do that, how to measure influence. And I'll conclude with maybe some thoughts about how we can introduce some frameworks that might be moved beyond the specifically architectural, but that is the nature of my historical work. And in particular, I look at this notion of revisioning. So this is from my book that came out a couple years ago now from Yale University Press called James Sterling, Revisionary Modernist. And I use that word revision very particularly. It comes from literary critic Harold Bloom. You may know his writings from Anxiety of Influence in 1973 is the most famous. Also a follow-up, A Map of Misreading from 1975. And these books were really powerful for me because they introduced a series of strategies for how strong poets, in Bloom's case, misread or misprision, he would say, their predecessors. And although his theory is articulated in relation to poets, I think its precepts serve equally well for any creative discipline, including architecture, and particularly ones where there are not only seminal masters, but also seminal works that constitute a kind of disciplinary history. So the key idea with revision for Bloom is literally to revision, to see again. So unlike a more neutral concept maybe of referencing or a more blunt act of copying, I'll talk about copying in a second, revisioning acts very deliberately and decisively on the precedent. It introduces a kind of correction. I was interested to hear Gloria's evocation of Vanderbeek's using this notion of the corrective as well. That was something that was critical for Bloom. And I think here we're reminded maybe of Eliot's famous quote that immature poets imitate while mature poets steal. Right, so the idea isn't, the notion isn't that anyone escapes being indebted to predecessors. The distinction is those that are influenced by the past, who make it into something new, or who simply repeat it. So in my work, my study of Sterling, I look, for example, in this example, on the left we have the Rusakov Workers' Club, a well-known Russian constructivist building from 1929 by Russian architect Anthony Melnikov, and on the right we have Sterling's Leicester Engineering Building from 1963, completed in collaboration with James Gowan. So the debt is clear, right? But how do we analyze this relationship between these two buildings? And so in the book, I use Bloom to talk about these dramatic projecting lecture halls, which are so clearly similar between the two, right? But I talk about Sterling's work as a kind of redemption and enlargement of the earlier work. Sterling, in a way, I think does Melnikov better than Melnikov. Bloom's frameworks allows us to see this referential act as forward. Not only does it it alters our understanding of Melnikov, but also potentially we see Sterling's work as superseding the original. Again, because I think it's a stronger version of the idea. The idea, does it take on the status of a kind of originary moment? Here's another example I use from Sterling. This is, in this case on the right, is a competition entry that Sterling did again in partnership with Gowan. This was an unsuccessful competition for Churchill College at Cambridge University. And on the left is an image that Sterling actually gives as a precedent. This is a Scottish castle from, I think, his collection of photographs. And so it's explicit, the relationship. He also gives as a precedent a more recent project from Le Corbusier, the monastery at La Tourette. But I don't think, this is not historicism, right? And I'm arguing here that Sterling's revisioning, this re-seeing of this idea of the college courtyard is important. And in this case, Bloom has a notion where he talks about generalizing away the uniqueness of a precedent to arrive at a more general solution, right? So it doesn't matter the specific form, it's the notion, the generic notion of a kind of college courtyard, right? So there's not one source, but a whole series of sources that are embedded. And I think this is an interesting way to kind of create a constellation of reference and a way to think about influence. So he returns to a kind of generic notion and becomes a kind of ideogram of the idea of a courtyard building. I think we can also, and I just want to take you through some recent projects that I've been working on and articles I've been doing around some of these ideas. So another concept I've been thinking about is self-reflexivity, self-influence, right? All architects and artists rely on motifs and shortcuts. How do we theorize those in the context of influence? I recently wrote an article on Frank Lloyd Wright's spiraling ramp on the interior, well, on his Guggenheim Museum in New York, but particularly thinking about that distinctive spiral, which is in fact an idea that appears throughout his work, beginning in the 1920s through to the 1950s when the Guggenheim is completed. On the very left we have what's called the Gordon Strong Automobile Objective of 1922, Sugarloaf Mountain, Maryland, in which there's a double spiraling exterior ramp for cars, not people. That's a Jaguar showroom from New York from the mid-1950s, in which he also uses the spiral. In this case, you're walking up and around the cars, which are them spinning on themselves spinning at the center of the space. And then on the right is actually a shop completed in San Francisco called the V.C. Morris shop, which is still extant. It's right off of a little Maiden Lane, right off of Union Square, which is a kind of miniature Guggenheim, right? It's 2 stories rather than 7. It was actually completed before the Guggenheim, even though the Guggenheim was designed first. So there's a complicated sequencing. So which is the original? I think copies and originals are tricky business in architecture, just like they are in the arts, right? But I think what I enjoy about them is I think they force our hand in thinking about how influence works when it's so explicit, right? Philip Johnson's College of Architecture at the University of Houston, completed in 1983, by the way, a completely reviled building by most who work in it and also architectural historians. But what I find interesting about it is that by Johnson's own admission, it's a copy, in this case of this drawing by French neoclassical architect Claude Nicolas Ledoux, the House of Education, designed 1770s for an ideal town of show, right? So, but of course the copy is not exact. A copy can never be exact. The crown changes from a circle in Ledoux to a square in Johnson. The colonnade is slightly different, the entrance is different, and importantly, that kind of stone plinth on which the Ledoux project sits, Johnson eliminates and instead has this actually kind of interesting, really thin granite band that's just a couple feet wide, so the building sort of seems to float. Johnson, by the way, copied all the time, right? He had copied before. In his glass house at New Canaan, which we see on the right, he was riffing on Mies van der Rohe's Farnsworth house. Again, we have an interesting, Johnson's gets completed first, even though he's basing it on, because he sees Mies's designs, so which is the source. Frankly derivative was Johnson's own description of the house. So how do we measure influence in these works? Building a replica of an unbuilt 18th century work versus deriving an architecture from a modern building from just a few years before. Johnson conveniently gives us a kind of cliff notes for his derivations, at least with the glass house. And this is an article that appears in the Architectural Review in 1950, and it's a little challenging to see, but basically he's laying out all his influence. He's like, I took the idea of the chimney from here, and I took the plan from Mies, and I took, right? He includes Mies van der Rohe, but interestingly, he also includes Ledoux. This image right here is a Ledoux project, right? So the cubic form of the glass house, he writes, comes directly from Ledoux's spherical maison de garde here. Okay, so in the one case, he's grounding Ledoux. In the other case, he's floating Mies. Both the School of Architecture and the glass house are architectural misreadings of precedent. Both are incorporating Ledoux. One is doing it more legibly. Does it matter if we register the reference? Is influence only as good as the legibility of the final form? A final example I want to raise is, as a kind of thought experiment in these questions around influence, is a recent project by the New York architecture firm Todd Williams, Billy Sien Architects. And this is, some of you may know this project well, this is the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, completed in 2012. And so this project has a very long, complicated history, which emerged out of a legal battle where the Barnes Foundation was desiring to move out of their location. This is a Paul Philippe Cray building from the 20s, completed in Marion, which is a suburb of Philadelphia, and the collection established by the museum founder Alfred C. Barnes, a notoriously ornery figure as well, had remained in this house, and so there was a battle whether it should move to Philadelphia so that more people could see it, or should it stay in this location, as Barnes's will, much like the Isabella Stewart Gardner here in Boston, Barnes was very explicit that it should never move. They won. The building, they were allowed to move the collection to Philadelphia, but for my purpose, what's interesting is that, so a premise of the move was that they had to, all of the ensembles, as Barnes called them, of the paintings, had to remain in exactly the same place relative to one another. So he had meant, by the way, exactly the same place to be in Marion, but they interpreted exactly the same place to be positioned on the wall relative to one another. And so there's all kinds of press about this, and all the praising this replica of the galleries that Williams and Sien created. And I should say, of course, it's within a very modern building, right? So this is the original Cray building, and you can see its kind of echoes here. It's this piece. This is the interior. But the Sien and Williams building is not actually an exact replica. They introduced deliberate deviations, some of which, so they use burlap instead of jute, some of it's, they use wood instead of steel for the windows, some of it they go back and kind of look at pieces, like for example, they hated these little heating vents, but they found that they were not original. This brings up really interesting questions in architectural preservation right now about how far back do you go, what constitutes an original. They introduced clear story lighting, which by the way, Cray was vehemently against clear story lighting, and because he felt like you were in an aquarium and you wanted the kind of studio lighting like the artist had. They also changed the molding, so you can see this is the original Cray building on the left. Here's this molding, which they were modernists. They had never done molding before. And they were going to eliminate it, and actually Billy Sien said, but it would sort of be like shaving off the eyebrows of this room. So they included molding, but they abstracted it, and they actually looked at the number of shadow lines, and they recreated a modern version of the molding. Okay, so all of this is to say it's a replica, and actually most of the press you read on it this part is sort of dismissed as the period room within their new modern museum, and many people find it problematic because they've lost the aura, et cetera, but I actually, rather than dismiss it as inauthentic or proclaim its precise accuracy as a replica, or even to extol its novelty, I think that what's interesting for me is that Williams and Sien challenged by conflating this boundary between original and copy. It's both inventive and imitative. It's an original reproduction. So to come back to this question of original, and I guess I had to put one picture of Bucky Fuller in here to have some relation to Black Mountain College, since none of the work that I do relates directly. But I think in thinking about this, a figure like Bucky Fuller, and there are others, but I think what's so important about these figures is that they do forced us to question the status of the original. Following Walter Benjamin and his well-known argument, right, once we have mass production, we no longer have an original. Objects lose that aura. Fuller's Dymaxion house that we see here was designed as a prototype to be replicated. Ironically, of course, today, the one that was built sits as a singular item on display in the Henry Ford Museum with the repressed aura has decidedly returned. But I'd like to end actually with a very strange, I've never shown an image like this in my life, but I was researching, so I want to end with an image that emerges from my reading on influence and struggling with identifying models to help us conceptualize ideas of influence. And this comes from art historian Michael Baxendall. And so Baxendall has a very short piece called Excursus Against Influence. And I think this brings up, by the way, the question of actually is influence the wrong word, and maybe we need a new one, but nevertheless. And in this, he challenges the kind of linear causal notion of influence, right? That X influences Y from the past to the present, and he likens that to a kind of traditional game of billiards in which you strike one ball and it hits another, right? So the past is kind of influencing later acts. So instead he proposes, I do not play this game, but the game of snooker. He also wants the Italian version that apparently has no pockets. But in this, on the game of snooker, there's many balls, right? There's many balls, there's no pockets, and importantly, it's not X hitting Y, but Y hitting X, and then when the whole field is rearranged, right? So, and when he talks about the fact that, so the strike of the cue ball, which we can see is the active reference to some, right? That becomes active. It allows, he talks about the fact that now everything is a new relationship to everything else. Some balls become more accessible, some become hidden, some are more available than others. And he concludes with, I think, a really powerful statement. Quote, arts are positional games, and each time an artist is influenced, he rewrites his art's history a little, end quote. So Baxendall, I think, challenges our conceptions of influence as passive, as a one-way movement from the past to the present, and he argues instead for its productive and transformative capacity. I want to end by returning to Gloria's initial evocation of creative research, which I think is such a powerful pairing, and a pairing that, frankly, I think just a generation ago would have seemed an oxymoron, right? So my hope is that research into models of influence allows us to not only understand the creative act, as she suggests, as tethered to earlier histories, but also to understand the creative act as something which itself reconfigures and repositions those histories. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. I'd like to start out by thanking the hosts. I'd like to thank Gloria, particularly for the invitation, along with Jenni and also Bree for hosting today. And my head is sort of spinning, I have to say, from having ingested a tremendous amount of very interesting yet diverse material today since the morning session, but I will, given that we have, I have a limited amount of time, I will try to stay focused on the topic of influence. And I think I am the only artist. So I'm going to, I don't know, I'm not going to address the things that have been said so far, particularly in relation to artists. I've made numerous notes, which Gloria assures me I'll have a chance to release in some form in the future. So that in mind, I'd like to talk about what this invitation has opened. And I'm going to, the images that you see are just going to continue, and I'm not going to talk about them until I choose to. Yet I'm going to read, more or less. Okay, to think about what this invitation has opened, to think about writers, poets, visual artists, musicians, choreographers, Black Mountain after effects and other effects, beyond institutional models, legacies, and affiliations, to study sociality between experimenters and friendship and love, ongoingness of study, to reflect on life conditions in relation to being and becoming and continuing as an artist, to probe remembering and missing people, past times within our lives and before we were born, in relation to the notion of influence, roles of artist, of teacher, of student in a life, and their permeability in relation to the notion of study. I'm using study in reference to how it is used in the book and PDF, The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study by Stefano Harney and Fred Moten. Reflections, thoughts, and feelings about times and influences that exceed what might immediately be imagined to be in relation to Black Mountain College. Ongoing questions concerning influence, influences, porosity, and dispersion. I'd like to emphasize that this invitation has opened the possibility to further probe different relationships, which in the process of considering I found to be very affecting, yet quite vast and profound. Certain images came to mind. The images that you see allude to the opening of possibility to consider, to which this invitation has given impetus to further explore and to be in study with. Something our gathering allows. At this time, I'll indicate aspects that I've found intriguing and that I hope to, over time, further follow. My approach is not as an expert on the field of education or as an expert on Black Mountain College. As the invitation I received suggested, thinking about influence is a part of the practice I'm engaged in as an artist and as a teacher, yet how it can be interpreted as well as interrogated is what I'd like to focus on. Particularly in terms of those who were becoming artists in North America during the Black Mountain College years 1933 to 1956, and after. How might influence take place? For me, that would be the generation of my parents. I thought about how within this designated trajectory, Black Mountain College, education formations models, North America, Germany, Bauhaus, which led to also thinking about South America, Brazil, School, 1950s, AACM, Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians in Chicago, experimenters, the right to aesthetic experimentation and life experimentation, as well as influences of models of art formation that developed in relation to artists, some renowned, some not, to musicians, conductors, choreographers, dancers, architects and designers, filmmakers, etc., continued. For an artist, how does influence appear? Nathaniel Mackey provides a compelling approach enacted in Discrepant Engagement, Dissonance, Cross-Culturality, and Experimental Writing, a collection of essays published in 1993. I was especially struck by his assertion that experimentation is a link between a configuration of writers who may not be thought of in relation to each other. In particular, he examines poets described in relation to Black Mountain, despite the ways in which our histories of artistic formation and sociality are usually described. Combinations occur that are not necessarily imagined when historicization takes place. Case in point, by Nathaniel Mackey, his essay, The Changing Same, Black Music in the Poetry of Amiri Baraka, is of particular pertinence. To give you an indication, here are some quotes. Consistency is one of the last words you would use in characterizing Baraka's thinking during the first 2 decades of his career. I have to mention that Nathaniel Mackey, he's a poet, he's a novelist, he's a writer, he's an historian, he's a scholar, so he's all rolled into one. So consistency is one of the last words one would use in characterizing Baraka's thinking during the first 2 decades of his career. Coming into his earliest prominence as a member of the Beat/Black Mountain avant-garde of the 50s and 60s, he wrote in 1959, still calling himself Leroy Jones. For me, Lorca, Williams, Pound, and Charles Olson have had the greatest influence. Eliot earlier. He went on to name Philip Whalen, Gary Snyder, Michael McClure, Frank O'Hara, Ron Lewinson, John Wieners, Robert Creeley, and Allen Ginsberg as some of the young wizards that everybody calling himself poet can learn from. 7 years later, in an essay called Poetry and Karma, having in the interim abandoned Greenwich Village for Harlem and the New American Poetry for the Black Arts Movement, he writes of his earlier influences and associates. White poetry is like white music. For the most part, and even taking into account those, quote, imitations, I said, which are all as valid as W.C. Williams writing about Bunk Johnson's band. Here the axles turned, the rust churned and repositioned. The death more subtly or more openly longed for, Creeley's Black Box, Olson's revivification of the dead, Ginsberg screams at his own shadowy races, or the creepier elements completely covered up with silver, rubied garbage, artifacts and paintings and manners and ideas. Through the years of his life, Amiri Baraka was noted for being open to experiment. While alive and in relation with other living beings, encountering was felt in myriad ways. But as distance from the living being emerges, I'm curious to continue thinking further in relation to what his traces still generate, in relation to Black Mountain, for instance, and beyond. As a student, I studied Baraka through his phases, and I also met him once with his second family. I also met members of his first family. Let's simply say that life can be complicated. In his words, published in the autobiography of Leroy Jones by Amiri Baraka, he opens the book with, "For me, being here has always been a condition of struggle and hopefully growth. These are attempts to sum up my life before having lived it all, attempts to make sense where it has been difficult to see any sense." These words are followed with a poem. I won't read because of the time constraints, but I recommend the book, The Autobiography of Leroy Jones by Amiri Baraka. It was written in 1984. As Nathaniel Mackey states his intention, which I'd like to indicate as it seems relevant to probing the concept of experimentation, quote, "In this essay, I will be discussing Black music in its dual role of impulse, lifestyle, or ethos, as well as technique, and subject matter in Baraka's work, exploring its usefulness as a focal point for pulling together disparate strands of Baraka's thought. His early attraction to projectivist and beat poetics, for instance, bespeaks an attitude that he and other spokesmen for those poetics repeatedly called upon jazz to exemplify. Kerouac, Ginsberg, Creeley, McClure, and others glowingly referred to bop improvisation as a technique from which poets could learn. Even Olson, for whom music was not of prime importance, remarked in a letter to Sid Corman in the early 50s, "How does, or is there, an analogy to, as I'd gather any of us do, to jazz?" Black music for Baraka, however, comes eventually to express the very spirit that leads to his repudiation of Olson et al., Black nationalist ferment of the middle and late 60s. What he rejects is an alleged failure of the Beat and Black Mountain writers to live up to the extra literary, especially political, implications of their poetics, implications they themselves often insist upon in their pursuit of relevance wider than the aesthetic. End of quote. One of the striking points among many that Mackey makes in this essay refers to the hopes of all of the poets in relation to writing. Quote, the importance of the notion of poetry as an agent of change and revelation to the poetic movement of which Baraka was and remains a part. The persistence of his celebration of Black music has to do with the persistence of a will to change, Olson's phrase, common to his projectivist, Black nationalist, and Marxist periods, a will that the music evokes and exemplifies. And here, Mackey quotes from Baraka from his liner notes to Coltrane Live at Birdland. There is a daringly human quality to John Coltrane's music that makes itself felt wherever he records. If you can hear, this music will make you think of a lot of weird and wonderful things. You might even become one of them. On influence and continuing beyond to fugitivity, remembering Amiri Baraka, bridge figure, according to Mackey, music, little magazines, experimental linkings, to go beyond. From these indications, I was inspired to stretch the terrain of what Mackey, as poet, writer, scholar, teacher, and editor, opens, and which Fred Moten continues to open as poet, writer, scholar, teacher, to think about influence and visual written art as I've been observing these. What about seeing, reading, encountering? Baraka, Beats, Basquiat, Gonzalez Torres. This is a beginning attempt to unpack lived times in an uncompleted lifespan. Different years began to become prominent, 1959, 1993, for instance. Both are times after the Black Mountain years, yet the influences, some related to what was emerging in relation to Black Mountain and also what went beyond, occurring elsewhere. Yet experimenting continued, as well as reverberations of subjects experimenting with how to be subjects who experiment in their lives, in the world. Once in 1993, I was asked to write on influence. How can I think of it now in 2015? I also wanted to think about ongoing conditions in relation to specific times and places, these being the work of mourning and loss. These are both also titles of books, the first by Jacques Derrida, published in 2001, and the second an edited compendium by David L. Eng and David Kazanjian, and including Fred Moten, Judith Butler, Wendy Brown, and others, published in 2003. I began taking further note of years, places, people, and links, aesthetic and radical. I wanted to think about my generation, quote unquote, in relation to influence and how might Black Mountain tropes have filtered in. I wanted to think about who was alive and who is now dead and what it feels like to live on beyond them. Particularities of death and life within generations in different places. Around 1993 and after, North American Museum exhibitions, Renee Green, World Tour, MoCA, Los Angeles, Dallas Museum Show. Jean-Michel Basquiat, Whitney Museum, and other locations. 1993, Whitney Biennial. 1994, Felix Gonzalez Torres, Traveling, MoCA, Hirshhorn, Renaissance Society. I wanted to remember people I've met and people I've known, to continue pondering what within living memory could mean and what significance it could have. Amiri Baraka was born in 1934 in Newark, New Jersey, the same year as my mother. They were of the same generation. He died in 2014 in Newark, New Jersey. The autobiography of Leroy Jones by Amiri Baraka was published in 1984. At the end of the book, in one of the concluding paragraphs, he writes, "But I leave you with this, all these words are only to be learned from the childhood, music, blues-bottomed class distinctions, black, brown, yellow, white, HU, Howard University, error, farce, village time, Harlem sojourn, home returning, black nationalist grown blood red person, all that is like some food for thought, some sounds meant only to say, look at this, dig it, what it means, where I and some others been. As Monk would say, let's call this contemporaneity and influence, contemporary art and globally dispersed notions of influence. I'm throwing this out as a provocation for further probing. My generation, quote, unquote, see Marcel Breuters, Beats, After Black Mountain, External Worlds. Around 1959, when that generational claim was made, those who were youths and young adults in the 1960s. Around 1959, perceiving influence through combined lenses, those who were born around then and in the 60s. Felix, born 1957, died 1996. Jean-Michel, born 1960, died 1988. Renee, born 1959, still alive. Greg Tate was born around 1960, and the external world, as it goes on. Thinking about Black Mountain in some decades and years since, 1959, 1969, 1979, 1989, 1999, 2009, what is within living memory, lifespans? By 2000, when the publication of the fiction of Leroy Jones, Amiri Baraka, took place in what I found to be a compelling essay prefacing the book entitled Vicious Modernism by Greg Tate. He provides further elucidation, which I interpret in relation to layers of influence and influencing, which can also be thought in conjunction with improvising and transmuting. He notes in 1999, quote, "For its complexity, invention, confessional recklessness, and abiding contribution to complicating the African presence in American letters, the fiction of Amiri Baraka deserves a closer read from contemporary audiences. Distant from the furor that surrounded the author when the stories were first published, today's readers should be able to give these major works the copious attention that they have always deserved." This is from the foreword of the fiction of Leroy Jones / Amiri Baraka. Entering into the terrain of influence, though usually stimulates me to want to open it, expand it, to think of it as an ongoing becomingness, as an unfinished conversation. So I wind down by mentioning other relevant participants in my constellation and thinking about today's topic, after Black Mountain and unexpected relations. Samuel Delaney, in The Motion of Light in Water, elaborates in a fugue-like contrapuntal fashion on forms of what I describe as discrepant engagement. Delaney was born in 1942 and lives in New York City. Joanna Russ was born in the Bronx in 1937 and died in Tucson, Arizona, 2011. Delaney dedicates a Paris Review interview of 2011 to her memory. And Octavia Butler was born in 1947, Pasadena, and died 2006, Lake Forest Park, Washington. All are or were artists in America, discrepantly engaging, experimenting with science fiction. At this stopping point, limits of biography, selected life indexes, I'm going to refer to the images. Francis Cole, musician, harpsichordist, jazz pianist, professor of musicology, Queens College, as a young participant in an arts conservatory called Indian Hill in Massachusetts early in the mid-1950s. As a child, I'd heard stories about this place from my mother, Gloria Sutton, who also attended with her friend Frances. They were teenagers then. Both were from Cleveland, Ohio. Gloria was a vocalist and Frances was her piano accompanist. Aaron Copland and Leonard Bernstein were in attendance. Ava Hesse, artist as a student with Joseph Albers, as a teacher at Yale in 1958. I received this book about Hesse by Lucy Lepard when I was a student. The book was published in 1976. Some of the book covers. Black Mountain and Exploration in Community by Martin Duberman, 1993. The book was first published in 1972. In his 1992 introduction, Duberman said he hadn't read the book in 20 years. The Recognitions by William Gaddis, a reprint, 1993, and also in 2010, this by Dalkey Archive. The book is described as providing an intellectual undercurrent during the 1950s and as an important book for writers becoming known as the Beats, and it was also referred to by Samuel Delaney. Gaddis was born in New York in 1922 and died in East Hampton, New York in 1998. Discrepant Engagement, Nathaniel Mackey, 1993, discovered in a half-price bookstore in Cleveland sometime after 2007. Nathaniel Mackey was born in 1947 in Miami, Florida. He is a poet, novelist, editor, scholar, teacher. He won the National Book Award for Poetry in 2006 and Yale's Bollingen Prize for American Poetry in 2013. For many years, he lived in Santa Cruz, California. The Leroy Jones and Mary Baraka Reader, 1991. The Fiction of Leroy Jones and Mary Baraka, forward by Greg Tate, 2000. Cover image, Jean-Michel Basquiat, untitled, Skull, 1981. Courtesy of the estate of Jean-Michel Basquiat, ARS. Vicious Modernism, a preface to Leroy Jones and Mary Baraka's fiction, plus Everything But the Burden, What White People Take from Black Culture, by writer and musician and director of Burnt Sugar Orchestra, Greg Tate, also of my generation. Felix Gonzalez Torres, Art Press, 1993, Art Resources Transfer, cover image, untitled, in parentheses, Alice B. Toklas and Gertrude Stein's Grave, 1992, C print, edition of 4, 14 3/4 by 23 1/4 inch, given to me by Bill Bartman, publisher and distributor. Renee Green, Sites of Genealogy, PS1, Contemporary Art Center, 1991, Queens, New York. Year-long work in spaces before renovation into the current museum, stairwells, attic, and basement. Now MoMA, PS1. Renee Green, Other Planes of There, back cover, Duke University Press, 2014. From Space Poem Number 3, Media Bicho, 2012 to 2013, The Motion of Light and Water. is the title of an experimental memoir by Samuel R. Delaney. He writes about coming of age during the 1950s into the 1960s in New York. He also describes his formation as a writer, aware of the currents which emanated from Black Mountain Writers, explorations of gay sexuality before it was named such, and experimental science fiction writing. Delaney is a writer and a teacher. From Space Poem Number 1, 2007, Octavia Butler came of age during the 1950s and 1960s near Los Angeles and Pasadena, and was from her youth a writer of science fiction, as was Delaney. Greg Tate has written about both. Tate is a writer, musician, and a teacher focusing on science fiction. The end.
That was amazing, you guys. Thank you so much for really a beautiful, beautiful panel. I feel like that was three amazing people doing what they do, and it just made me really happy. I'm Carrie Lambert Beatty, and I'm an art historian, and I thought that I'll just share a couple of quick thoughts that maybe we can pick up on and continue. One is there were so many kinds of influence that we were talking about and thinking about as you spoke. And it struck me suddenly that influence is really two questions. You know, it's a question about time and history, and it's a question about agency. Because influence is a strange word because the agency is sort of on the part of the person in the past. You know, so-and-so influences me, a historical person influences me, so I'm the object there. I don't get, my influence is it's like paying it forward, right? Which is sort of interesting, and I think for Renee, I was thinking about that a lot, and the way that it's like the agency of the dead in some strange way, right? Some illogical way that I really like, and can almost be a kind of haunting. So there's that. And then I thought maybe it would be useful just to list all the different kinds of influence that we were talking about today. I have to thank you for the snooker, for the Baxendale. I love Baxendale. Everybody go read Baxendale. That's a wonderful image. I think that we have, in art history, our sort of postmodern hangover has a lot to do with the prohibition on biography and thinking in terms of individuals' figures' lives, and this question of influence that is, that had a long history of being a very connoisseurial type of question that had to do with value and so on, more than thinking big historical thoughts. So it's always a tension, I think, in our field between the desire for historical specificity that you hear in the kind of historical rigor of the way this exhibition is put together, that you heard with Ruth talking about this information that is out there yet to be archived that we're going to get, right? The sort of responsibility of the historian that Michael spoke of. The tension between all of that impulse and the impulse to talk about the big cultural forces, right? The big things that can't be reduced down to the question of, who did this in September and who did this in November and who was in Paris and who was here. We have to keep those two things in circulation all the time, and the question of influence becomes a way to do that. So I heard, Jenni started it because I was, the question is, how do you conceive of influence? And I was like, oh boy, art historical influence, with my postmodern hangover thing. And then the first thing she said is, how does art influence you? And I was like, oh, that's a whole different question. That's amazing that it's actually, that you can think of it as two sides of the same thing. So we can talk about the influence of art on us personally, and then the other question that came up a lot, the influence of art or of places like Black Mountain and moments on the future. We heard about the influence of artists on creating their own stories with Michael. We heard about the role and therefore, the sort of the influence art historians can have on the historical record, which is another important piece of this to keep in mind. There is the question of the concept of revisionary relationships to the past. See, that's different. That gives the agency back to the person who is taking the influence. And so that was, I felt like a strong move on your part to keep that's the difference between using the term agency and using the term revision. So clearly something we could talk about a bit. The taking an active role in relationship to the past. And then there's the question of art's ability to create change, to influence the world outside of it. Those were the main ones. Oh, and then the specific questions, and this got a glancing touch, but I think it's super important, of thinking about art, contemporary art in a global context. And from the very beginning this afternoon, we had that kind of idea with the maps, reminding us that even as we do this very local look at what happened in North Carolina, and think about American art, that it's already an international and a global story, and one that's interwoven with history. This is something that, for people working in art now, we can't not think about. That is the different moments and the different kinds of influence that things have in these sort of asynchronous relationships when people are coming from different parts of the world, different traditions, different times of experiencing those influential points. So if I can distill that down into a question, it would be this. I was sure I was going to have an end to that sentence. It would be, which of the kinds of influence do you see not being addressed enough in art discourse or architecture these days, and why would they be important to us?
First of all, I just want to thank you. That was a tricky group of presentations to put together, so masterful job as the respondent, just because we're all talking about really, I think, different things. But around this question of influence, it's worth noting that, so the etymology of the term influence is the same as that of influenza, meaning a sickness that is like descending. There's some astral connotation too, that it's sort of like this idea that you're saying that comes, that you have no control, that it's just kind of overtaking you, right? And I think for me, the power of the Baxendale model, and I think of all of the things you just were enumerating, is the possibility to introduce this revisioning, this agency, to see how we subsequently influence. And actually, I think the reperformance is maybe an interesting term to bring back in here, right? How, as we reperform works, how that affects their understanding, that this notion of breaking down the kind of stasis of the object or the figure in the past, right? As well as collaboration. I think all of this. So for me, I guess, in terms of what's not addressed, that's a great question. And I think the complexity of the term, actually, I alluded in my presentation that maybe, sometimes I get worried the term isn't even right anymore, right? Like that we need to invent a new term somehow, or revision the term itself, because that connotation is so strong of that astral sickness suggestion, and the one-way kind of linear idea also. But I'm really encouraged and excited by this, even just this way of beginning to open up different possibilities. It's a little bit dizzying, I think, then, right? Because it's uncomfortable for us and it's disorienting in terms of, there's a semantic question about what terms do we use, but disciplinary ones as well, right?
Yeah.
Maybe in relation to, that, to think about maybe affection and affliction. They're kind of related also in a similar way. I guess, when you asked the question, Carrie, like what doesn't get addressed enough in terms of influence, I think that perhaps we could think, or I can say for myself, I like to think about the things that you love,
I felt
and
that in your
what
talk.
affects you in that in sense. I did want to mention, though, there's something that I forgot that I think is important to mention in this context, and it was in relation to a message I received. It was before the conference started, and it was from Russell Williams, who is here, and who introduced himself to me via email with material, 2 articles about his mother, Alma Stone Williams, who in 1944 went to Black Mountain College and was one of the women integrating it.
Wow.
And he introduced himself to me just before this panel. And I think that there's such a complexity of material that we've encountered today and that continues to emerge. And I think that what everyone did in terms of trying to open up the possibilities for being able to look differently, and to look at what happens after events take place, and also when things are frozen in images and you see them and you weren't born then, and you see what appears like something that could have been enjoyable or fun, or people, having these great times. I mean, I showed this image of a friend of my mother's who was a relative of Nat King Cole by chance, sort of in this jovial moment in the 1950s as a youth. I think that a lot of these things are very deceptive in terms of, I think that, many times people can appear very happy or whatever, partying and photos and whatnot, but life is pretty complicated. When I think about North Carolina during those years, chills run up my spine. I think about it as something like, I just don't want to be, I'm so happy I'm not there. I can't even imagine, and so what I think is really incredible, though, is that given all of those factors, it was possible for an amazing experience of experimentation to take place for a number of different people. And I was trying to bring that out. Yeah. The experimenting aspect is actually the link between many people. That's what attracts people. That there's that possibility. There are many, many stories that are not told, many stories. And yet, I think the affection for what's possible with experimenting is something that's key. And this is not a kind of, I don't mean it to be this sort of namby-pamby kind of idea, meaning I think it's something that's very powerful, and it's not just like a liberal thing. I think it can be very radical.
Yeah, I mean, something I'm sort of like affect, the feeling of these talks coming together today here in the context of the morning too, is this feeling that these things can coexist, that like that search for empirical records of people whose stories have been missing, like that can happen and needs to happen, and of works also. At the same time as we take more experimental ways of thinking history into account, and ways of thinking about the relationship of past and present that don't depend on that linear model that hardcore historical research is usually tied to. Should we open it up, or did you have something, Michael, before?
I just wanted to build on what Renee said. Carrie, you asked, what model of influence do we think is under-investigated? And I liked what you said about, I forget who you were quoting about art, maybe it was Jenni, about art's influence on us. And
it was Jenni.
The older I get, the more tedious I find the typical academic model and affect of, don't get excited about things, don't make it fun, because you're not going to be serious, And if you are excited about what you're looking at as an art historian, or you have a personal investment, or you speak that investment, and it's effective, meaning there's feeling behind it, then you're boosterish, or you're not critical enough. I think this is a very bad model for teaching to students, because I think students should actually see that art and thinking and creativity creativity and imagination has a deep impact, and effective, meaning that it can move us. Those things move me. In fact, I was recently speaking to one of my best friends who's an artist, and I said, the only things that are important to me now are imagination and creativity, because those are the things that are meaningful in my life, and art brings those things to me. And that's why I do what I do. I mean, there are a lot of downsides to being an academic, but one of the upsides is actually to be an art historian and be connected to art. So that idea of allowing the thing that influences me to show in, as something that it does influence me, and I don't have to be objective or neutral about it, is important to me.
I think that's like a big part. That's kind of feminist pedagogy, I mean, in part.
We do have a mic for some questions, and there are
Questions,
some.
yeah.
So there's just...
Oh, I think, could we, Ruth?
One model that, excuse me, one model that I was thinking of is also present a little bit through the show, in fact, through another blueprint, is the model of gift giving. And I think that gift as another thing for thinking about influence, both that it's this gesture of generosity, but at the same time, one doesn't ask for a gift often, and it kind of sets up these whole structures of then repayment. And in the show, we have a piece that Robert Rauschenberg made, a blueprint that he made on the occasion of Jack Torkoff's daughter Hermine's birthday at Black Mountain College. I think she was turning 11 or 10, and he made this blueprint, and it's on this big salon hanging. But I think that the gift and the kind of the model of generosity and repayment in the complex way that that's part of the gift exchange could be another model for thinking about influence.
I once was in a studio visit with an artist, his name I'm blanking on, but she talked about influence as in terms of kind of like hospitality. Like the influences were these kind of uninvited guests who showed up at her studio, and she was like, oh, Louette, hi, come on in. No, really, just come on in, You have to deal with them even when it wasn't sort of your idea to go out and seek them. It's that same thing about agency.
We have time for one more question.
Thanks. I'd like to propose that if this kind of symposium is held again, that we eliminate a section on influence. To me, and I really appreciate what you said, and I forgot your name, the guy sitting there.
Michael.
Michael, thank you, Michael.
Guy.
I mean, just an immediate response to an event, to an item, to something. And we'll worry about, delineating and cataloging the influences later, because in a way it denatures the work, it denatures the event, it denatures the experience, and I don't know at the end of the day what we're left with that would be particularly useful.
Does anyone want to say what they're left with that is particularly useful?
I mean, I would just say back to that I wouldn't, prior to an event, create some kind of a set of rules of what should or should not be included. I actually think, my sense is that the organizers tried to create a kind of overarching kind of framework and different viewpoints from which to see the material, and this was one of them. I mean, I see the questions of influence as being really interesting and enlightening in terms of how we look at works of art and institutions. So
I think the idea is that we're using, if I understand, we're letting Black Mountain and that investigation that's happening in the exhibition influence us in our thinking about things that may not be Black Mountain specific. So if you came really wanting an academic or a conference on Black Mountain, then I can see why that might be disappointing. I'm sorry? Okay. Let's talk about it afterwards. I'm sorry, I didn't understand you.
So in response to that, I'm the executive director of Black Mountain College Museum in Asheville. And recently someone said something really terrible about the museum, which was, oh, I feel like that's a place that laments the past. And if we only look at the period that the college was open, or only think about what happened while it existed, we might be lamenting the past.
I mean, the influence, the way it extended is beautiful, and it hasn't actually been networked or mapped in a really coherent and cohesive way. And these threads, as they move outwards, are fascinating to follow. They're wonderful stories, so why not? I mean, the experience of those stories is also very exciting. That was enough.
Thank you.
So I wanted to thank each of the presenters this afternoon. We have reached the final panel of the day, so I just want to take the opportunity to thank you. While we're getting settled, I also just wanted to thank Penny Taylor, who did a very great job of putting together all the visuals for today, so thank you. And we did start the day with an artist, Sarah Vanderbeek, and we will conclude with another artist right now, Anna Craycroft.
Hello. I'll just wait for everybody to settle for just one sec. So like everyone else, I'm really grateful to be here. It's exciting to be at a conference that tries to make a new model or explore what a new model for conversation can be. So yes, thank you, Gloria. Thank you, Jenni. Thank you, Bree. Thank you, Thomas. Thanks also to Helen Molesworth and Ruth Erickson for putting the show on. My name, did I say this already, is Anna Craycroft, and it's interesting for me to explore Black Mountain College. I feel like it's a curiosity, it's a source of inspiration, and it's also kind of impossible to get my head around, and I feel like as a teacher and an artist, I really stand in the shadow of its legacy. So I'm going to talk about it in context to research that I've been doing for a number of years. So the title, as you see, of the talk is Parallel Players, Black Mountain College, Early Childhood Education, Radical Pedagogy as a Blueprint for Art School, or for art making, or just for art. So for the past 7 years or so, I've been thinking how an artwork could be like a teaching tool, specifically a teaching tool from early child pedagogy. And I would like to just ask everyone in the room for the duration of my talk to suspend the ideas of the child as like this little cute person who squeaks and stuff and sometimes is annoying, but to think about, or like some perfect previous self, but to think about it as actually just a state of being. So if early childhood education represents like a state of becoming, a state of process. So I've been wondering how I could make artwork that does what this work does, which is use idiosyncratic thinking and esoteric ideas to construct an aesthetic system and signature form, I guess, to reach out to people and change the way they see the world, much like these 5 pedagogues did. So for this conference, I expanded thinking beyond these 5, which I think of all the time, who I'll talk about more in a second, to thinking of 10 individuals who also worked with, including those 5, who worked with early child pedagogy or developed their own form of it in a utopic community model. So I'm going to talk very briefly about them in the interest of time. I got really overzealous with the research and have so many images for you guys, so just bear with me for the brevity of my language. First one, Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi, great-granddaddy of early child pedagogy. 2 sites that he had, both Neuhof and Verdun, were essentially farms that were designed to reach out and teach the poor. And his I guess you could call it a tenant, his treatise was really things before words, concrete before abstract. So he is also the granddaddy of the haptic, right? The granddaddy of hands-on learning. So the next one, Robert Owens. He was an industrialist, more of an industrialist than a pedagogue, but he also believed in education reform. He had 2 sites, New Lanark and New Harmony. New Lanark was actually a town in Scotland that has his cotton mill, a population of about 2,500 people, and he built a school called the Institute for the Formation of Character for children, to kind of take the children out of the factory. And then he tried to sort of create a similar model, utopic community, in the U.S. that was in Indiana, and it was called New Harmony. And New Harmony, and the dates, I'm not going to say all the dates because you guys can read them. He didn't do this one alone. He brought a boatload of knowledge, a boat of educators down the Ohio River to the site of New Harmony, which was, I think, supposed to be about 1,000 people, about 20,000 acres. And at the center of this site was the school. And that school, the school was founded on Pestalassi's principles, who I was just talking about. Then after him is Friedrich Froebel, who some of you may be familiar with. He's the inventor of kindergarten and really the first person to create the teaching toys, the tools, the occupational gifts. So he kind of made material Pestalassi's proclamation about thinking through objects. All right, his place, Blankenberg. So Blankenberg is the kind of most successful model. Froebel had multiple sites where he had these utopic communities, or one of them was an orphanage. Blankenberg was where he really honed his principles for kindergarten. The next one is Amos Bronson Alcott, famous for being the father of Louisa May Alcott. So he was a transcendentalist, also influenced by Pestalozzi, Froebel, and he wrote books on pedagogy, as they all did. His school was here in Boston, not actually that far from where we are right now, called the Temple School. It was housed in a Masonic church, and he had about 30 students. It was a very controversial school, both for religious and race-related reasons, so it closed very quickly. John Dewey, who's talked about all the time in relationship to Black Mountain College, but what isn't talked about specifically is John Dewey's early child pedagogy, which he developed at the laboratory school. These schools still exist, but they've taken kind of a new form. They're schools within universities. And although the laboratory school wasn't like a community, it was essentially supposed to be like the model. The school itself within the school is supposed to be the model for a community, a kind of microcosm of a community. And then there's Francesc Ferrer Guardia, who was an anarchist and activist in Spain, and he started the Escuela Moderna, and it only took a couple of years for these to spread like wildfire all over Spain. He devised these schools in defiance of an educational system at the time that was controlled by the church, and ultimately was killed for his radical practice, implicated in a plot to assassinate the King of Spain. But after his death, his ideas were revived in New York at the Ferrer Center and Modern School, and then in New Jersey at the Ferrer Colony, which was about 68 acres, 100 families, really ethnically diverse, super diverse backgrounds, and also sort of serving the poor. Maria Montessori, who was a physician, her first Montessori school proper was the Casa di Bambini, and that had about 50 or 60 kids, and many of you have probably heard of Montessori, really still very active. This school no longer only lived for a few years, but the practice of Montessori is widespread. Rudolf Steiner, the Waldorf School, also a continuing program worldwide today, was initially developed as a school for children of factory workers for the Waldorf Astoria cigarette factory, and within a year was open to the public because it was so popular. One thing I'm not talking yet really about the pedagogy, but Steiner was an anthroposophist, and so there was, like in the Temple School of Alcott, who was a transcendentalist, there was a really strong religious discourse, but really in many of these pedagogues in their day, the link between spiritualism and science, between spiritualism and moral practice and how you raise a citizen was really integral to their pedagogy, a lot of which has been lost in practices of those pedagogies now. A.S. Neal, the Summerhill School, this is also still active. The actual site is still active. It sort of sounds like a bomb, which is, I think, really apropos for the Summerhill School, which is a free kind of radical school for kids who to behave however explosively as they like to. It's essentially a boarding school, and you have to pay, so it's not serving the poor as many of the others started out to do, but it's the ethos of the school is, I think, really directed towards a kind of personal liberation. Loris Malaguzzi, one of many people who started the Reggio Emilia School, this is after World War II, Northern Italy. Many families got together to develop a school that was municipally run because all of the other early child centers were run by the church. And that Reggio Emilia, the city, is still very much involved with its Reggio Emilia school, and the practice is another one that has gained a stronghold worldwide. Okay, so just to sum up, what I see is the correlations between what these 10 people practiced in their schools and advocated for and what I see in Black Mountain College, teaching the whole person, the focus on the process of becoming, which I talked about earlier, haptic learning, which I talked about, the originators, as they're the originators of the object lesson, being a citizen of the world. So many of the schools practice things like farming, building, weaving, etc. So learning complicated ideas through really practical application. And then freedom, experimentation, and equality of their community members like these. And so a Joseph Albers quote, "To break through the boundaries of those teaching and being taught, because then everybody will be teacher and student at the same time." For me, that runs in line with this idea of the child and early child pedagogy as a representation of any human being in a constant state of becoming. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to show you, assuming that what I'm looking at is what you guys are looking at, I'm going to show you two slides side by side. All of the slides on your left will be from Black Mountain College, and all of the slides on your right will be from a big mashup of all of the 10 pedagogies that I just talked about. So first I'm going to just quickly look at community, parallels and comparisons in community. So I won't talk as much about Black Mountain College because a lot has been said about it, but also for the brevity, because I have so many images I really want to show you guys and stay within the time. So this is an image from New Lanark, the Robert Owens, and where dancing was a really crucial part of the curriculum to culture the citizens, to give culture to the poor, and to prove that man becomes human by virtue of his societal life. That's a quote from Owens. We have here a picture from a Friedrich Froebel kindergarten where the plots in the garden are both individual and for the group, and kind of paralleled in the image from Black Mountain College garden, a photography lesson in the garden. Here's a picture from the Temple School and the Socratic dialogue that took place between the professor and the students. A famous book came out of this, I think was called, that was written by Alcott, called Conversations with Children on the Gospel. Super radical, asking children what they thought about God. And then this idea of educating the whole person, right, and school being a microcosm of society. This is a picture from John Dewey's laboratory school, and a quote from Dewey: "The child is an organic whole intellectually, socially, and morally, as well as physically." Again, also thinking about the person as a whole feeling, thinking, social being. This is an image from the modern school, so this is a quote from Freire. "The education of a man does not consist merely in the training of his intelligence without having regard to the heart and the will. Man is complete and unified whole." And here we have the idea of self-governance, which has been talked about today. Here's some faculty members self-governing without the administration of Black Mountain College. And here is the school meeting that takes place bi-weekly, or twice a week, at Summerhill, thank you, where the students have as much of a right to vote and as much of a say in what happens in the school and every decision that's made in the way that the school is constructed and the kind of punishment that does or does not happen as any adult in the room. And then also developing curricula through dialogue, a quote from M.C. Richards. At the opening of each term, all would gather to hear what teachers were proposing and what students wanted. The dialogue produced creative results. And here we have a picture of Reggio Emilia students performing what is coined in English as emergent curriculum. So all of the curriculum that takes place at the school is developed out of the conversations with the students. And then now thinking about the pedagogy and practice parallels. So here's the Olson drawing that we saw earlier that Gloria showed. And this is a diagram of New Harmony that's was made recently, but just sort of explaining how the school is situated within a larger social environment that expands beyond just the school, right? So it's like the conversation is meant to go outwards as well as come back in. And then here's some of the curricula of a Black Mountain College, I think one semester or year at the Black Mountain College, and then this is a diagram of Friedrich Froebel's kindergarten, showing the interconnection of disciplines and their relationships to concrete forms. Over here we have a picture from a Reggio Emilia school, the atelier. So the atelier, what does that say? Really? Oh my God, you guys, this is so sad. Okay, I'm gonna go back through really fast. Work as play, I have to wrap up like completely, I'm over time. Okay, all right, so if you wanna see these later, I'll totally walk through them all, hours, we can sit for hours. So farming, like I said, the thing with John Dewey, you learn while you're doing. This is a lab school. This is a Montessori school. This is the modern school. This is Summerhill. Here we are again at a lab school. And this is an important one. This is John Dewey. In their intrinsic meanings, play and industry are by no means antithetical to one another. Work which remains permeated with play attitude is art, in quality if not in conventional designation. Montessori, that was a modern school, and then this is Montessori again. Montessori. I should just like really fast go through these. Reggio. This is also Reggio material studies, very similar. Joseph Albers and showing the students line with their bodies. Rudolf Steiner. This is another Rudolf Steiner movement. The importance of process. This is Reggio documentation of process. Also Reggio. Time measurements, thinking about measuring time in a way of understanding the world. That was Cage and Pestalozzi. Buckminster Fuller may have gone to a Friedrich Froebel kindergarten, so it's been cited. And then more Reggio and thinking about expanding from just understanding a material to Shawinski's understanding a material as a performative act, experimentation with materials. This is Montessori. I'm so determined to get through all of these, you guys. So this is just really hilarious, the comparisons of the different exams, if you have a second to read them. And then the same, this is with Reggio, what's called a provocation. I'm almost done. Experiments with personal freedom. This is a Western Union wire about the arrest of some Black Mountain College students, cover of A.S. Neal book. And then I just want to close with two quotes. M.C. Richards, this is a picture from Summerhill, and this is the quiet house built at Black Mountain College. So what did I learn there? Seeing one's original face for the first time. Can I bear to be called by my name and to stand in the shine? And A.S. Neal, free children are not easily influenced. The absence of fear accounts for this phenomenon. Indeed, the absence of fear is the finest thing that can happen to a child. Thanks.
I want to reiterate my thanks to Jenni and to Gloria and to Bree for having me, and I'm going to think about the legacies of Black Mountain College in the sense that having just published a book
on the topic. It's the kind of inevitable question that one asks oneself is what happened next, and what are the kind of afterlives of these ideas, and in particular the idea of experimentation. That was the focus of my book, and to really think through, in particular, in the case of the presentation today and the book project that I'm working on called The Fuller Effect, what, to kind of work through the passions and the kind of commitment that so many people from the 60s to the present have when you mention Fuller, Bucky Fuller, and the kind of enthusiasm, especially in my role as an art historian, as an art critic, to kind of to be the kind of intermediary, in a sense, to all of the studio visits I've done, all of the kinds of conversations in which that enthusiasm for Fuller erupts, and I have to say, sometimes my antipathy to it. So, in the sense that there's many things in my book that I felt kind of tried to engage critically with Fuller, but also and hopefully what you'll see today is that, I'm not here to kind of take him down or anything like that, just to really sort of think about, in the case of space exploration, what we might sort of think about a legacy of Spaceship Earth, which was a phrase that Fuller popularized and by the 1960s became a kind of pop culture, part of the sort of popular culture lexicon. So maybe just to kind of set this up a little bit in terms of a notion that I think is one of the productive ones of Fuller's pedagogy at the college, is really the acceptance of failure in the interest of a larger project, and the way that became extremely a very formative pedagogical model for members of the Black Mountain College community, and then for, sort of percolating out of there and Fuller's teachings in the 50s and 60s and beyond. And just to kind of think about failure, of course, in terms of not just the failure of the college, in the sense that it closed, but also, the kind of failure of historical memory in a way. Just to give you a little sense of where I'm coming from this, I used to spend my summers in Black Mountain, the town, and my relatives have a long history there. My great-grandmother retired to Black Mountain, and my grandmother retired there and lives there still. And so, having spent so much time in the region, I had never heard of Black Mountain College. It wasn't until I was a college student myself that it ever came up. So, obviously, the region did a very good job repressing that history, and I think very recently, it's kind of begin to be recovered, particularly in Asheville. But, to think about, let's say, Buckminster Fuller in 1969 published a book called Utopia or Oblivion. And I sort of want to think through what that means in this talk, and then maybe the kind of oblivion of what became of Black Mountain College, and the way we're sort of picking up some of the pieces in recent years about what was so important about it, but maybe to kind of think maybe, I don't know, like utopia is a kind of oblivion? I don't know. We'll see. So I can't see what you'll play here. I'm just going to show you two short films.
We have the technology available to give everyone on Earth the highest standard of living in history, or we can destroy ourselves. At the end of the session, thousands of red chips are scattered over the map. One chip for each nuclear bomb in the world today. Buckminster Fuller has proved his point.
This is Jeff Bezos last month, the founder of Amazon.
And what is going to lift off from Launchpad 36? Well, I want to give you a little sneak peek. Here it is, the new orbital vehicle. It uses our BE4 engines. It uses our BE3 engines. We're very excited. It's vertical takeoff, vertical landing. It's an architecture we have a lot of experience with from our New Shepard program. It's a great architecture because it's to an unusually large size. It's a fully reusable booster stage, and next year I'm going to share a lot more details with you about that vehicle. And I want you to know, one day, I don't know how long this will take, but one day I look forward to having a press conference with you guys in space. Look forward to it very much.
Okay, so I'll get back to some of that. But I just want to, we've seen many images of Black Mountain, and I'm not going to speak specifically to Fuller's time there in any great depth, but just want to think about this notorious event in 1948, which was the attempt Fuller made to erect his first geodesic dome, which did not succeed and was rather good-naturedly termed the supine dome. So I think part of the the lore of the college has to do with this attempted. It was a collaborative mission in a sense that people tried to go out there and make it. And for Fuller, he felt that it was a kind of demonstration of his anticipatory design science in the sense that he knew it didn't have sufficient tensile strength to stand up, but he wanted to think about construction as something that that could be a process of building until it stands up, and so that you could treat buildings as though they were confetti, that they could just kind of be seen as something that was a process of really prototyping and an amazing model, I think, to this day of ad hoc architecture, to really imagine a way of constructing that that allows you to not only sort of play with the process of construction, but to think about other elements that are not often foregrounded in architecture, such as buoyancy and lift and the weight of a structure and the nomadic possibility of moving structures around. And this comes out of Fuller's work with geodesics, which is defined as the arc of great circles, and his attempt in the Dymaxion map from 1944 to create a very low distortion projection of the Earth that was intended to be distributed to school children. Now that didn't succeed as a model of mass production, and nor really did any of Fuller's patented works. And I think this was a kind of interesting undertow of Bucky Fuller's sort of rationale in terms of the efficiency of structures was always predicated on a mass production distribution, which never succeeded. And just one thing I want to note about the Dymaxion projection is the way in its representation of the Earth, it could be mutable. You could have what's on the top there, you have an all-land path through the way that this map is organized presently, but you can rearrange the components ideally, and so as it lays flat, you have an all-ocean route on the bottom. And so his attempt to think about distribution flows, resource flows, and the redistribution of some of the habitual ways of thinking about the way that resources move throughout the Earth came to a head in the project in 1969 that he initiated called the World Game, which the first iteration of it was in New York City, and it continued throughout various colleges into the mid-70s, and in fact there's still a World Game Institute today. And what it was an enormous Dymaxion projection on the floor, and then a kind of whiteboard kind of situation in which many variables could be kind of written up on the surrounding area, and then people would literally kind of use the map to move some of these resources around, and college students would be given the kind of participatory agency to rethink, to turn weaponry into livingry, to quote Fuller. And this interesting comes out, speaking of weaponry, this comes out of Fuller's lifelong collaboration with the U.S. military. Never quite as successful a collaboration as he would have wished. In 1940, he had created this Dymaxion the deployment unit, which was adopted by the U.S. military during the war, but not to a great extent, and many others of his projects, including radomes, which were golf ball geodesic domes that were used as radio hubs in remote Arctic outposts. And strangely, the first successful geodesic dome assembly that Fuller brought to Black Mountain College the following summer in 1949, after the supine dome, had been constructed on the lawn of the Pentagon only 2 weeks before that return to Black Mountain. So this kind of brings me to the oblivion part of the talk, which is some of the currents of thinking about, or the metaphor, I guess, of spaceship Earth that Fuller was using as early as the late 1920s. What does that really mean? What does it mean, another kind of Fuller phrase, we are all astronauts, to kind of think about the Earth as a vehicle
for our fantasies and perhaps this kind of sense of junking it when we're done. Because of the Earth and the kind of ecology of the Earth is considered to be a kind of cabin ecology, or something, a sort of a capsule ecology. And of course, various failures that I think now are coming to be known as the human-altered climate change of the Anthropocene, means that perhaps the notion of spaceship Earth is yet another exit strategy to think what's going to happen in terms of space colonization, or the, other kinds of ways of leaving the envelope of the Earth, and in whose interest those departures would serve, who's going to be at that space conference in space, that the press conference in space that Bezos talks about. Of course, there's immense utopian associations, I think, for my generation and slightly older about the dome and about all of the things that this is the Spaceship Earth dome at Epcot Center. And the vision of a model of a kind of future as a technologically controlled one, that you would have this kind of capsule architecture that you wouldn't be able to survive, let's say, without your astronaut suit or whatnot. So I just want to, in conclusion, bring to the fore a few contemporary artists that are kind of challenging the spaceship Earth model. This is a project by Thomas Saraceno, in which he's really interested in that Cloud9 project I briefly showed of the kind of moon-like hovering geodesic structure. This is a space elevator that he designed and acted out in Argentina. Very different than this, the very traditional notion of the rocket here that Bezos is offering us in the Blue Origin. And to think about, this is something that is a concern of mine in terms of the privatization of space and the notion of space tourism. In terms of Bezos, Elon Musk's SpaceX company. He was the co-founder of PayPal, and then Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic. We really have the future of space, which was once the kind of prospect of our notion of futurity, in the hands of 3 or 4 billionaires. And as space tourism, it's not really going to be available to many of us, as the ticket is about $200,000 for your 6 minutes of weightlessness and that beautiful Earthrise and the champagne you get on your way back. So just this kind of much more modest sense of the space exploration that's being explored here. I'm just going to skip the Matthew Day Jackson here. And maybe even this, because I know we're running short on time. These are some projects by Alexander Mir that she's been really concerned with, the correlation between a sort of heavenly ascension and the astronaut, and so these collages kind of represent that. And she did a wonderful monumental Earth work project called First Woman on the Moon. Kind of reminds me of that footage of Smithson making spiral jetty here, these bulldozers converting a Dutch beach into lunar craters to stage this. The first woman on the moon joined by her friends. And just as a final thought, this is a project I've written about and was somewhat critical of by Trevor Paglen, called The Last Pictures, in which it felt like a kind of elegy, not unfamiliar from that rhetoric of new space, what's called new space, those kinds of companies I mentioned by the tech billionaire, founded by tech and other billionaires, that the Earth is fucked and we have to leave. And that escape, strategy is really one of a kind of expansion of capitalism and neoliberalism into space, and the sort of refusal to think of that as a kind of social project, but one of a kind of libertarianism, I suppose. So, with this Last Pictures, Paglen was attached 100, and these are just 2 examples, 100 exemplary pictures that are that represented in his mind, and I guess polling other people, the kind of history and prospect of humanity, and attached it to a satellite that was actually launched into space 2 years ago. And really in the kind of legacy of the space capsules, actually the image that you see on the on your right over there was in a Carl Sagan space capsule sent, I think, in one of the Galileo missions, in which he staged human consumption as licking, eating, and drinking, sort of like a fantastical
thing. What would people think if they found this? It's like, this is what we do. And the 1959 Moscow exhibition there on your left was also one of the 100 pictures, and it felt like this elegy for humanity that's already lost. And part of Paglen's argument is that space debris up there circling endlessly will possibly outlive humanity. And so there is this kind of sense of a kind of depressing end. But I was kind of persuaded and thought this project that he's been working on more recently was an interesting extension, and maybe one that sort of reclaims space outside of some of these realities and also narratives of escape and of, technologically dependent humanity, and this, exceeding the envelope of the earth as something that is like an extension of capitalism. And this is a non-functional satellites project in which he designs satellites that actually could and he hopes to be launched into space, whose only purpose is to when they kind of streak by, to be as visible as possible. And of course he's worked, and I don't know, some of you might be familiar with his career, he's worked on thinking about the militarization and commercialization of outer space. But to imagine this other use of space that might be a kind of aestheticized one that kind of returns us to some other claims on that utopian. Space has always been the kind of repository for our sense of the future, and a kind of utopian hope, that we could sort of organize that more collectively than these projects of space tourism. So I just wanted to leave you with that. And sorry, this is rather rushed, but I do want to keep my 15 minutes. So with that, I'll turn it over. Next speaker? Is that good? Yeah. Cool.
So I've been given a couple heavy charges here. No? Okay. One is to bring it home, supposedly. Maybe to bring you to your knees, I don't know, no. But I want to thank Gloria. Gloria's book, she uses the word generative capacity a lot, and generative people, and it was great last night to think about how many of Stan Vanderbeek's projects and other people's projects were actually done when John Cage had a fellowship at the University of Cincinnati. So under which guise do things happen? It's great. And also Jenni Sorkin, a wonderful co-collaborator and colleague over the years. So great to be here, and also with many other distinguished speakers. Today I'm going to focus on Karen Carnes. She's in the Black Mountain exhibition. I'm going to do a little anti-nostalgia for you instead of nostalgia. I think that what you're looking at here, you could see it as clay, unfortunately, but that would be the worst way to see it. You're looking at seating, as well as some bird feeders. The birds are not hers. They were put on for the image in the Saturday Evening Post covering the 1964 Design Triennale in Milan, where she was awarded a gold wreath. Seats are curious technologies. The seats you're sitting in could be comfortable to you or not. Today, they could have created community or not. And I would say what's really interesting to me about Gloria's book, but about seating as technologies, is that seating can bring us into great intimacy. Our knees can rub up, even at the same time as they disable us physically. And so when I look at the Videodrome and when I read Gloria's book about being in the Videodrome, yes, you have this velocity of images, but you're also absolutely, on your back and disabled. So the physical primacy of these chairs is what I want to talk about. The space is almost an immersive environment here. It's designed by Charles Forberg, an architect who I'll talk more about. I'll show you other work by him. And the orchestration of the Milan Triennale is fabulous. It was orchestrated by Edgar Kaufman Jr., the Museum of Modern Art curator, and Jack Lenore Larson. My other problem with my big job today is that someone told me that the ceramics looked pretty but not interesting. and in the Black Mountain Show. So I need to make them look interesting to you, and so I'm going to look at this work by Carnes, because I think seats are really meaningful, and if you can't get the meaning of that, we have a problem. So seats are interesting. They kind of are really an act of colonizing space, and that's how I want you to think of them today. They are for settling, and yet also they're about feeling unsettled. I'd say you make a seat in order to assert that this space actually exists as a place, not just as a space. So in Carnes's work, we have a lovely double-shaped vase in the exhibition, which is really, I won't get into it, but it's lovely to see it mirrored here 10 years after being at Black Mountain in this double stool, and you'll see more images of that. But what are two stools kind of combined by a thin little kind of umbilical cord? They are a kind of yearning for companionship and for community, but maybe also a kind of indication that two people can't do it. I'm kind of here also because I've made the trek, or the pilgrimage, or whatever you want to call it, to the Vanderbeek Videodrome. Here it is, peeking through the foliage. And this is a very easy place, again, to get nostalgic about, but moving up closer to it and thinking through the space, you're looking through not a rustic place, but some place that's really in between. It's only 35 miles north of Manhattan. It is the context in which Carnes made this strange seating. Paul Williams, who we talked about briefly, one of the people who both financed as well as constructed buildings in Black Mountain, makes the move. Paul and Vera Williams, a couple from Black Mountain, with David Weinrib and Karen Carnes to settle, and as well as M.C. Richards and Cage, to kind of settle this space. But what is the space that they're settling? And are they making this bucolic pastoral place charged in a different way? They're looking through fiberglass, kind of call wall fiberglass board, incredibly toxic here. You're looking at welded struts overhead, buildings made of cinder block, and inside of the Vanderbeek home, you're looking at asphalt flooring, intentionally trying to mimic the streets of the Lower East Side, in which supposedly, I was told, keys and bottle caps were embedded in the asphalt in order to kind of mimic the detritus and the kind of edge of the Lower East Side, where Vanderbeek had moved from. The furniture was intentionally distressed, furniture pulled off the sidewalks. So this is not entirely rustic. Here you're looking at the current resident of the Vanderbeek home, Roger Phoenix, and one of the remnants left from that period of time. This is Stuart Brand's performance cum art project, America Needs Indians, on the walls. Interesting psychedelic kind of primitivism. You also can think about David Tudor's little space, a kind of hermetically sealed shack where, in the shape of a piano, in which his piano would ultimately, unfortunately, be too affected by the stream nearby and the humidity. So there was a lot of failure here and a lot of interesting work being done. There are a bunch of early music composers that no one's mentioned today as a kind of weird collage of people. None of these people were, Black Mountain didn't exist. We talked about a little bit the liberal arts existing there too. We haven't spoken that much about the poetry today. And so this place, the land, if you want to call it that romantically, or Gate Hill, if you want to name it after the street, is where Carnes is living when she makes this work. Cage is side by side with her, and he's doing some interesting things like making commercial art, commercial advertisements for Jack Lenore Larson. So this is, these are lovely kind of combines of collage which existed both in mass production and then also in limited batches. But what are these weird Carnes objects that we're going to look at? You're seeing a bird bath, and then which was actually saved in Carnes's backyard, and then you're seeing a stool which was thrown out. This is where Carnes made her work and had her shop, And this is Carnes living at Black Mountain. And I think one of the really interesting things, if we're going to talk about chairs here, is that she begins to first make large-scale objects to decorate, install, design for a motel on the mountain, designed by Junzo Yoshimura, the same architect who designed the Japanese house inside the Museum of Modern Art Garden in 1954. And then she goes on to build large objects like this hearth. And here she is living there, and she's sitting on these three-legged Appalachian stools, which she and her husband, David Weinrib, purchased outside of Black Mountain at the Southern Guild of Handicraft. But then right next to her is a Charles Eames chair, right? So, which is only 2 years old, which she's buying down in Manhattan. And so this notion of going off the grid but really being in touch with the world is interesting. Right next to her hearth is a Lenore Tawney hanging on the wall, and then an alto chair. And the reason I'm really interested in these seats is that there's not a room really in the world you can find which is full of objects like this, of course, right? You'd have to go to like some kind of alto building to find a place where seating intentionally was designed to change ideology, right? So in some kind of alto city hall, you might have every elected official sitting on a stool in a room, but you're not going to find that either in the Hilton or in any other building in America. So what is this chair, and what does it do? And if you look at it as an object, it's not entirely interesting. It's somewhat interesting because what she's doing here is she is not Karen Carnes, the virtuosic potter, the way that she might exist in some museums or in ceramic histories, but what she's doing is actually going back to ground zero in a way that Albers wanted her to do. She makes her first journey to Black Mountain actually in 1947 with Albers, who she describes as very like this. She goes back in 1952 to work with her husband to run the pot shop after it's turned over from its first founder. And what she's doing here really is working with coils. It's something everyone in this room has done as a kind of primary art education experience. And she is, in working with coils, doing something extremely banal and kind of really returning to a fundamental way of working that's also very centripetal and centrifugal and off balance. It's quite hard to actually preserve coils in this way. So she's in some ways taking a really banal approach and turning it into a kind of new thing. I first approached these stools, or found them, when I was a teenager in the Noguchi Museum. There was one there, and before they built the Americans with Disabilities ramp, it was right behind that space. It's no longer on view, but it was the one object in the Noguchi Museum that wasn't by Noguchi. I thought it was by Noguchi when I first saw it. And here in the Noguchi Museum, what's really interesting is that this kind of proved to me that they're interesting and important objects in a sense, because he recognized it as such, but also because it fit the biomorphic abstraction of Noguchi's garden. Here they are in Jack Lenore Larson's strange theatrical Bantu house in Amagansett or nearby in Long Island, and I journeyed there a couple summers ago to see them. They're still there. This roundhouse is intentionally looking at African houses that Larson saw, and Carnes made all sorts of work there. I can't really show you the urinal, that'd be indiscreet, but the hearth here, the stools. Carnes makes these stools and the seating from about 1957 to about 1970. In 1955, she's arrived, I think, at the land, and in 1958, David Weinrib leaves her to raise their child solo, and so she's a single mother working at Black Mountain, trying to make a living off of ceramics, pottery, selling lots of casseroles, and such, also selling them through outlets in New York City. But what's really interesting is I think she starts making these when she's single and embarking on a period of living alone, and then she ceases making these ceramic stools when she partners up with Ann Stannard and enters into another long-term relationship. So I have a long-standing interest in these stools. I recuperated 2 of them to put in this exhibition that just closed at the Museum of Arts and Design. It'll open down in Washington next week or so. But instead of showing them as social objects, they become, unfortunately, static objects in these spaces. And of course, they were meant to migrate between the interior and exterior world, the patio and the living room. That was a kind of essential breakdown of space at that time in the 1950s. And what's interesting is that when she's put into the Milan Triennale, she is a kind of a symbol of the idealization of leisure. And here you see how she's installed as this hearth space. The bird feeders, I think, in some interesting way, make explicit this kind of notion of alternative colonization and the miniaturization of community. I'm going to skip through this, but the high-tech chairs of the time, David Rowlinson 40 under 4 seating, is in marked contrast to the leisure of Carnes and her space. Since David Weinrib is an interesting figure who's often left out of these histories, I thought I'd throw this in, especially because he stands as and this is his yoga book published in the 70s. It's kind of like this reminds me very much of these spaces we were looking at last night with Vanderbeek's images and tantric forms and this notion of a kind of a visual space that is really about slowing down. There's other seating also at Gate Hill. No one could identify for me what this was or who made it exactly. Welded seating. But the interesting thing to me, I guess, about Gate Hill and about this kind of colonization after Black Mountain is that it's a place where people struggle. It really is not entirely bucolic. I'd say, and I don't want to offend anyone here, but it's dystopic as much as it's utopic. There are there's pain and anguish around relationships, and there's a way in which you can see it as a kind of the work coming out of there as a kind of negotiating the problems of communitas as much as the idealizations of communitas. So I'm 25 seconds over time, but in lieu of a standing ovation, I thought I would ask you to sit on the floor with me now, to aspire to the condition of starting from ground zero. Since you're all Black Mountaineers, it's not that much to ask, right? And we might kind of abandon our assumed positions and return to ground zero. So thank you. I would have had us just sit on the floor for, I don't know, 5 minutes and how many long? 33 seconds?
4 minutes. Did we lose? Wasn't Jenny going to moderate?
Yeah, our moderators abandoned us. Oh. She said, I don't want to sit on the floor, but you can.
I'm not sitting on the floor.
I was going to stay on the floor with you.
So I just had to, since I happen to have an image I didn't use of Karen Carnes, I'm going to just bookend Ezra's wonderful presentation with a juxtaposition of Karen Carnes at Black Mountain, which is the image we see over and over again, with her teaching her last summer workshop at Haystack Mountain School of Crafts in Maine. And we actually have somebody in the audience who's organizing a show on Haystack from Maine, which is wonderful. But also to say that there's a lot of different kinds of utopias and a lot of different kinds of pedagogies. And one of the really amazing things about this panel is that you all brought this different levels of what I would say are hope, that there's a kind of hope that courses through each endeavor that you all described. So there's this sort of futuristic moment in Eva's presentation with this idea of almost a phallic penetration of outer space, but was still interesting. And then the Buckminster Fuller roundness, juxtaposing that. And also, I have to ask you, or at least bring this up, the different kinds of visions we have for artists today, in that I was very struck by the idea that Buckminster Fuller really wanted this relationship with the military and the industrial military complex, and an artist working there today would really be a kind of an anathema to contemporary practice. That's the enemy in so many ways, and so that was really fascinating. Ezra brings to the table this dystopic / utopic space of Gate Hill or Stony Point, which is one of the places of re-examination that we hope to get to in the next iteration of wherever this conference goes next. Between Gloria and I, and try to organize a kind of experimental book project or web project that comes out of this conference, because that's one of the spaces that we're particularly interested in. And Anna does a wonderful job of cataloging these experimental pedagogies throughout the 20th century, beginning with a sense of German kindergarten and how German kindergarten influences Bauhaus pedagogy, and how Italian Montessori and the Steiner School, and how all of these different kinds of iterations of experimentation get to a place of these spaces of education that we traverse today. And so I wanted to sort of summarize a bit, but also find out if we could go back to this idea of dystopia. And I don't want to end on a negative note, but I think it's actually a really important one, because I think that there's this strange American syndrome we have of having to put a positive spin on things, and that the beauty of Black Mountain is that we know it fails in some way. It closes. There's a closure. They can't keep it running. And I'm wondering if anybody wanted to take up the notion of failure in any of these kinds of ventures that you've considered.
There was, just to invoke MC Richards once again.
You have to speak into the microphone.
Okay.
Nobody can hear you.
So talking for MC Richards again, I read a quote that I don't have handy, but where she says that Black Mountain College didn't close, it had a life, that she sort of sees. I think she might even gender it and call it a woman and say she lived and she breathed and she was an accident and she was an experiment and she was explosive, and then she passed on and she lives on in the minds of all these people. It's a beautifully romantic sentiment, but I think I guess I just wanted to drop that in as a way to say that it's not. I don't think it's a binary of utopia versus dystopia, but this idea of flux. And I mean, the way that I ended up at this, I think the way that I ended up at this conference is because I was so super over the moon when I found out about Gloria's book, and that's going through my interest in Stan Vanderbeek, which comes out of Black Mountain, which then takes me back to Black Mountain. It's like this. I think the way that these ideas circulate in the world just doesn't. Within every utopia, there seems like there's simultaneously a dystopia. So I see them simultaneous, I guess.
And the way I think of it is more as the performative space in which there's a kind of, if in a performative space you become someone else, as so many people who passed through Black Mountain did become someone else, it enabled them to become someone. I think, whether it's in identity or in their production, some of those people sustained those guises, and then some of them didn't. And the failure of not sustaining the guise isn't necessarily failure. It's just it's the sense of passage through theater and a passage through time, because we really are talking about, at the end of the day, I thought about this with Michael Lobel's presentation especially, we're talking about people's lives so much, more than we're even talking about, and who are we to talk about their lives? And it's a very interesting space to get into. That's what I thought when I went to Gate Hill. There's a messiness to these lives. Do I want, I don't want to, you don't want to pull the objects out of that messy life, but the object isn't necessarily, it's not a failure to leave it in the past, or is it a failure not to leave it in the past. I mean, there's ways to think through those different performances as you think through yourself as an artist, but also as an art historian or curator.
Can failure be productive, though?
Yeah.
Yes, 100%. Failure is only ever really productive.
Maybe not. I mean, I suppose in thinking about Buckminster Fuller's rather technocratic vision of what these prototypes and resource reallocations would head us to in a period that was really fundamentally a kind of post-scarcity model of, if we just rethink the and kind of redistribute, we can not actually think about a class war or democracy. We can have the supercomputer bring everyone up to the standard of the wealthiest. And that post-scarcity fantasy, doesn't really take into account, the kind of failure of technocracy to think about in whose interest resources are not equitably distributed. What do you?
It's for me.
Okay.
That was a
I sound like emotion.
It's like, what is failure too? I mean, it's madness to be a production potter or a poet like M.C. Richards in the Atomic Age. So that's not necessarily failure. Is our and maybe I could frame this another way. Is our failure to read Stan Vanderbeek's poetry today, as opposed to just exploring his sound and image immersions, failure, or is it productive?
I'm not going to answer that. I'm going to turn this over to the audience who's been really amazing today, and there's a lot of artists here that we would love to hear from, or if anybody wants to take a stab at commenting on something on this panel or something on a different panel. I'm on my way. He's still on the floor.
Thanks. Hi. I'm an exchange student from Johannesburg, South Africa, and before I studied art, I studied the Alexander technique, and this whole Black Mountain College is completely new. I'd never even knew it existed, and I also all this information is completely new to me. And obviously, you spoke about John Dewey, and he was an Alexander teacher. I don't know if you guys know that link or made that link or even know what the Alexander technique is. But I was interested if you have any historical knowledge on if and how the Alexander technique was incorporated into the Black Mountain College. If anybody knows any of that information, or if anyone else does, they can speak to me afterwards. Just personal interest. Yeah.
No idea, but I have no idea, but that's an amazing line of research, I think, to pursue. I mean, I think there was a lot of different kinds of movement practices going on there. So I would be surprised that if Alexander wouldn't.
I don't know anything about that, but there were different kinds of emigres in different parts of the world that emerged from the Bauhaus in particular, and I don't know if that's one of the links there, but there was a sort of somebody who had studied at the Bauhaus who ends up in India doing an architectural school. There's somebody else who does an arts and crafts and design school in Israel, and so there is movement, and definitely in other parts of the world, way beyond the American, the link that we make between Germany and the United States all the time, and so it's a really wonderful reminder. So thank you for bringing that up, because it's something that we haven't really touched on at all today in terms of the globalization of these different practitioners and really vivid movements across the globe.
Hi, my name is Liz, and I recently was able to be at the Walker Art Center for the opening of their exhibition Hippie Modernism, which is also about kind of utopian structures, communities, a bit later in the 1960s. But I was thinking in your discussion about utopia and dystopia and failure about an interview that I did for the catalog for that exhibition with the artist Tony Martin, who was involved, with the San Francisco Tape Music Center and liquid light projections and things like that. And I asked him about his relationship to the idea of utopia during our interview, and he brought up the very, I thought, good point that, the word comes from, no place, like that utopia is always an impossible sight. But the things that he connected to about the utopian movements and kind of moments of the 60s was these broad and deep connections between individuals. So the failure of Black Mountain College and this kind of dystopian turn that it, no longer continued to exist seems not only inevitable in the idea of utopia not really being able to exist, but that the connections of it, as is demonstrated through this exhibition and the symposium, kind of extend on.
I think perhaps rather than utopia, though, in terms of the actual, on-the-ground feeling, it seems, of what it was like in those brief years of its existence, is perhaps more of a progressive model, both of education and community. Progressive in the sense that they thought of education as both a process of personal growth and social transformation. So that, I think, is why we look to it so much in terms of an artist-run model, because that vision doesn't really seem to align any longer with what education does in its much more privatized manifestations today. So we kind of harken back, I think, to the idea that artists, were the ones that were kind of putting forward this progressive models, and, also of progressive models of form, and the interconnection of those three things: form, community, and education. So I don't know if they really would have been using that language of utopia to self-define, but I do know that they use the language of progressive.
Hi. I have a cold, sorry. My name is Steve. I lived at the land for a while and in the Dome. I just have a comment on this notion of, failure. Is that the word we're using for it? So there's, conceptually to me at least, a difference between something not continuing in some way that it had been continuing and then stopping. I don't think we build a school and decide that it's successful as long as it's open and then it's no longer successful when it's closed. I don't think we define that as the life of a person. Everybody who's dead is now a failure. It's kind of a funny way of looking at that word failure. I think what we mean is failure in terms of the process of art or anything is that or the way it came clear with the Bucky Fuller incident, is that failure means that you tried to do something and you learned from its not being completed what you would have to do, and very often you learned something that you weren't even thinking about. And in this case, it seems, I don't know the history very well, it seems like perhaps he did that intentionally in order to sort of make his students aware of that. I don't know if that's really the case, but if that is the case, that's a clever thing for him to do as a teacher. As an individual, but I don't think that's what we normally mean by the word failure, so I think we just need to keep that in mind when we're tossing that word around and keep asking.
I'm not using failure in a negative sensibility at all. I think it's actually a very productive term because it's so loaded and because it's got this finality to it and it scares people. It's a scary term to call something or pronounce it a failure, and yet somebody like MC Richards came and founded Stony Point because she felt that Black Mountain in some ways had failed her personally, and she loved it so much, and so she really wanted to start what she called a weekend Black Mountain at Gate Hill, and she could not rouse her colleagues to do that with her because I think she herself was very committed to teaching and some of them weren't. But to me, this idea of failure is such a loaded term that I love it because there's an edginess to it, and I think that some of these quandaries that we're facing particularly in education and in living, but Black Mountain's not the only liberal arts school to ever close. We have situations like Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio. There's a whole movement afoot about, anxiety around rural liberal arts colleges right now and their ability to sustain themselves. And so I think Black Mountain is potentially a model to think through some of these pressures, economic pressures now. But, as somebody who's lived at this community, I'm sure you have a very different take on this, and I think this is the tension, is being able to talk to living people and butting up against your lived experience and a sort of diluted historical sense of place. And I think that's what Ezra's getting to when he says these are real lives, these are real people. Like, we have to remember that we're not just going and extracting the objects out of these contexts, but this is life. These are people's lives.
I'll piggyback a little bit on what both of you were saying. I'm Mark Davenport. My mother was a music major at Black Mountain from 1942 to 48, and we were one of the first families at Gate Hill, and I lived there until I was 30 years old, and I'm writing a history of the first 20 years at Gate Hill. But I would say in the work that I've been doing with Paul Williams, who was the principal architect and the person who funded Gate Hill, and also a student of Bucky in 1948. He was there when he was, the failure of the first dome. But I would say one of the most important things that Paul Williams talked about in terms of that experience was learning, sort of underscoring what you were just saying, is that he was learning from the failure of that experience. That was part of the process, and in almost any kind of art form, you learn first by failure before you have your successes. But I would also add to what when MC left Black Mountain, she did talk about how much it was a failure, and why did they fail if they were so smart and intelligent and they had the answers. But she pretty much retracted that idea later on. And I think it was in Sprouted Seeds, which is what you might have been referring to, the Merv Lane book, where she talks about how, in retrospect, she really felt that it wasn't a failure. I think for a lot of us who come from academia and institutions, we think of longevity as a sign of success. So if a school has been around since the 1875, it's a success. Whereas we don't see something that lasts for 20 years or 25 years necessarily as being a success, because we're judging on a whole different level of sort of different paradigm of what success or failure is. I don't think there's anything wrong with failure, and I think you were saying that either, but I don't think that they ultimately thought that Black Mountain was a failure. I think if it was, we wouldn't be talking about it still. It had a life, it sort of organically had a life that existed for a certain amount of time, and then it ended just as a human life ends. And so I think we have to view it in a very different kind of way.
Can I just say one thing, though, and I don't want to beat a dead horse, but there are productive failures, and then I feel like what I was trying to get at with the afterlives of Fuller's ideas, that they're also millenarian fantasies. And I'm just going to read this quote that I transcribed from an interview with Gene Youngblood that Fuller gave in 1970. And he's speaking about the world game, and he said, "It is the way the 5-year plan is done. And the great pressure on all of us is the whole world is going to fail, and it's going to fail in a hurry. We don't need to have any other enemy but ourselves." So I think the sense of failure that was being propagated, especially by the late 60s in this kind of Fuller logic, was really a kind of millenarian, sort of hopefulness in space exploration because of our inability to shepherd the Earth's ecology. And I think that is like not a productive failure, and I think we're sort of living, with not only the kind of Youngblood, Fuller media ecology idea of like what to do with that in terms of the world game as like an information fallout, like that we all have all of this stuff that we can't, manage in terms of how to allocate resources and redistribute them, but to really imagine like what our responsibility is in a kind of like global community, I guess.
We have one more question here. I just want to make everyone aware we are at the end of our time in this space. So,
yes, speaking as an artist, I would challenge the use of the word failure, because I think artists have to teach themselves to think in other terms, or, as has been pointed out, all of them would have stopped their artistic practice within 2 years out of art school. I used to say that there's a very fine line between survival and success, and I wasn't going to make a judgment for myself. And I've also heard people talk about, I haven't succeeded yet. So that word yet, I think, is very helpful for going on. Finally, the idea of influence, which has been so much talked about today, is different from talking about does an institution succeed or fail? Does a business succeed or fail? We do have a model for businesses succeeding or failing. We don't say that they die, but they stop functioning, their products probably die. I don't think you're talking about ideas that have died, and I think it's the ideas more than the institution that count.
Oh, there is one more question?
Thank you. My name is August Vanderbeek, and Stan is my dad. And I wanted just to say it was interesting seeing Mark and Steve, I think, bucking the issue of failure, because we were raised on the land or lived there. And one of the things that I think I'm very grateful for my dad is that he always told me to take risks, and now I have a much better understanding where it came from, in part. I mean, it was who he was, but he said, you've got to fail. I mean, and I think it's really instilled in me maybe a little bit of a Pollyanna attitude, but I definitely really appreciate being able to see the good in things. And I tend to be able to see the good in many things, and hardships too. And I also wanted to say this was very inspiring. This whole day has been really inspiring. And I'm going to start crying like my mom. And my heart is pounding. So I'm coming away with just a lot of things to think about and talk about. So thank you so much for putting it all together. And I really am also fascinated by just by archivists creating history by their interpretations. And I see how I've learned things. I mean, I lived with the asphalt floor and chairs sinking when it was hot. You know, our chairs would go, and then one day I came home from school and my mom was like hammering, the things that you put on, studs that you put on clothes, into making a pattern on the floor. And Dad talking about wanting to have a dishwasher pulling out of the middle of the table. I mean, it was wild and crazy. Lots of hardships and lots of incredible creativity, but aliveness. And now I've lost my train. My point is that I see that there have been some mistakes presented, and so I don't know quite. Maybe I should just come up and share them at some point. So one particular, Karen Carnes's picture was not at Black Mountain, but it was at her home.
I think you meant that.
Oh, okay. Okay, then maybe I misinterpreted that. Okay, but there was a few other things.
You said it was Black Mountain, but it was actually.
Oh, did I? I apologize. Yes.
And so,
I really spoke about was Gate Hill. It's not.
And I don't want to disc anything because it's always wonderful. But I do know with Mark, he's going to be writing this book, and I'm wondering how his creative perspective is going to influence how history is created in recapturing the land. But anyway, I want to thank you all, and hooray, and I hope you all have a good day.
So we've asked Gloria and Jenni to come up and just give us a few comments before we wrap up
I
the
think
day.
just to close, I want to evoke one last Buckminster Fuller-esque statement, which is the concept of critical limit, and I think we've sort of matched that or met that right now. It's the maximum capacity before a structure or form fails. So I think in terms of image, information, conversation, conviviality, homage, and deep gratitude to every single one of you who have come out and had this dialogue with us that we intend to continue having. I'm going to close on that. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. This has been a really wonderful and productive day for us, and we hope for all of you.